My name is Derek Lutton, and what I experienced at Blackwood Camp over 3 days in October forever changed my understanding of how brutal humans can be when they believe no one is watching. I write this now from the relative safety of my apartment in Seattle, but the images I witnessed in those remote Oregon woods haunt me every night, and I know I'll never fully erase the horror of what I encountered among the pines and ferns of that wilderness. I had planned the trip as a solitary long weekend getaway, 3 days of hiking, nature photography, and a chance to completely disconnect from the stress of my job as a systems analyst at a tech company. Blackwood Camp had been recommended by a colleague as a perfectly remote spot, an abandoned former scout camp now used as an informal access point for serious hikers seeking solitude in the Willamette National Forest. The drive from Seattle took 5 hours, the last hour navigating increasingly narrow forest roads that wound through woods so dense they effectively blocked out sunlight even at midday. My GPS lost signal about 48 kilometers before my destination, and I had to rely on a printed map and occasional trail markers to find my way to the camp. When I finally reached the parking area, a small gravel clearing that could maybe accommodate 6 vehicles, it was 4:30 in the afternoon on an October Friday. The sun was already low on the horizon, filtering through the forest canopy in golden rays that created an almost ethereal but also eerily somber effect. The camp itself was about 1.5 kilometers from the parking lot, accessible only by a narrow trail that wound through old-growth forest with trees so massive that 3 people holding hands couldn't encircle their trunks. It was exactly the kind of primal solitude I'd been seeking. No sounds of civilization, no evidence of modern human presence, just the forest in its purest state. But even during that initial hike to the camp, something felt slightly off. I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Maybe the complete absence of audible wildlife, or the way the wind moved through the trees with a low, steady moan that sounded almost like distant voices. Or perhaps it was just my urban mind adjusting to an environment so radically different from my daily life. Blackwood Camp turned out to be more extensive than I'd expected. Instead of just a basic camping area, it was clearly the remnants of a well-established youth camp that had been abandoned years ago. There were multiple wooden structures in various states of decay, a main lodge that might have housed communal activities, smaller cabins that were likely dormitories, an outdoor kitchen under a corrugated metal roof, and even the remnants of what appeared to have been a natural swimming pool. Most of the structures were in poor condition, sagging roofs, moss-covered walls, broken windows colonized by vines, but some of the smaller cabins seemed structurally sound. My plan was to pitch my tent near one of these cabins, using the structure as a windbreak and possibly for gear storage overnight. It was while exploring the cabins to find the best camping spot that I made the discovery that would turn my quiet weekend in the woods into a nightmare that still wakes me screaming. In the second cabin I investigated, a one-room structure with a small porch that seemed to have been a camper dormitory, I found evidence of recent occupation. Not just evidence that someone had been there, but evidence that someone had been living there for an extended period. There were sleeping bags that appeared recently used, empty food cans showing no significant rust, and even fresh ashes in a small fire contained in a coffee can. There were also personal items scattered around the cabin: clothing, a hiker's backpack, paperback books, and even a small radio device that seemed to be in working condition. My first reaction was disappointment. I'd come here specifically for solitude, and the evidence that others had been using the place as a semi-permanent base camp suggested I might encounter other hikers during my stay. But there was also something odd about the arrangement of the items that I couldn't immediately place. The personal items seemed to belong to at least 2 different people. There was both men's and women's clothing, 2 sleeping bags of different brands, and even 2 distinct backpacks. But everything was scattered in a way that suggested haste or carelessness, as if the owners had left quickly without taking time to organize their belongings. I also noticed that some of the items appeared to have been disturbed by animals. There were food cans that had been chewed, likely by rodents, and some of the textiles showed evidence of being nested in by small mammals. I decided to explore the other cabins before choosing my camping spot, hoping to find a structure that showed no evidence of recent occupation. But what I found in the third cabin made me realize something was terribly wrong at Blackwood Camp. The third cabin was slightly separated from the others, connected to the main camp area by a narrow trail that wound through tall ferns and fallen logs. From the outside, it appeared to be in better condition than the other structures. The roof was intact, the walls showed no significant damage, and there was even a small patch of wild herbs growing in what had once been organized planters by the porch. But as I approached the cabin, I immediately noticed a smell that stopped me cold. It was a sweet, cloying odor that didn't belong in the forest. Something organic that was decomposing, mixed with an underlying chemical smell I couldn't immediately identify. The cabin's door was ajar, swaying slightly in the forest breeze, and creating a rhythmic creaking sound that was deeply unsettling in the forest silence. Through the gap, I could see that the interior was darker than the other cabins, as if the windows had been covered or blocked in some way. I should have walked away then. Every instinct I had told me not to investigate further, to return to the parking lot and find another place to camp. But curiosity, combined with a growing concern that someone might be injured or need help, pushed me to approach the door. "Hello?" I called out. "Is anyone here? Is everything okay?" There was no response, but the smell grew stronger as I neared the entrance. It was definitely the odor of organic decay, but there was something else. A metallic scent I recognized but didn't want to acknowledge. I pushed the door fully open and stepped inside the cabin. What I saw made me vomit immediately. On the cabin floor, on what had once been sleeping bags, were the bodies of two people. A young woman, maybe 25 years old, and a slightly older man, possibly 30. Both were clearly dead, and they had been dead for some time. But it wasn't just the fact that they were dead that made me react so violently. It was the condition of the bodies and the scene surrounding them. The woman was positioned in a way that was clearly unnatural. Her arms had been carefully arranged at her sides, her legs were perfectly straight, and her head had been turned to face the door directly, as if she'd been waiting for someone to enter. Her eyes were open, but they had developed the milky opacity of death, and her mouth was fixed in what looked like a smile, though it might have just been the result of post-mortem changes. The man was in a similarly orchestrated position, but there was something even more disturbing about his arrangement. He had been placed with one hand extended toward the woman, as if reaching for her, and the other hand was positioned over his own chest in what seemed like a theatrical gesture of romantic death. Both bodies showed evidence of advanced decomposition, suggesting they'd been dead for at least several days, possibly a week or more. But there was also evidence that the bodies had been tended to. Their clothes had been cleaned and smoothed, their hair had been combed, and there were even wildflowers that had been placed around the bodies in a decorative pattern. The most unsettling part was their faces. Both had been made up with what appeared to be paint or dye from wild berries. Their cheeks had an unnatural flush. Their lips had been dyed a bright red, and there was even color applied around their eyes that created the illusion they were awake and alert. It was like a grotesque parody of life, as if someone had been playing house with corpses. After vomiting on the cabin's porch, I managed to stumble far enough away to think more clearly. My first reaction was pure panic. I had stumbled into a crime scene, possibly a double murder, in a location so remote that help was hours away. My second reaction was the realization that whoever had done this to these two people might still be in the area. With shaking hands, I pulled out my cell phone to call the police, only to confirm what I already knew: no signal. I was completely alone in the woods with evidence of a violent crime, with no way to communicate with the outside world. My options were limited. I could hike back to the parking lot immediately, drive until I could get a cell signal, and report what I'd found. Or I could investigate further to try to understand what had happened here and possibly gather information that might be useful to the authorities. The sensible option was to leave immediately. But something about the scene I'd witnessed, the careful arrangement of the bodies, the applied makeup, the decorative flowers, suggested a level of mental illness or sadism that made me feel that simply reporting the deaths might not be enough. What if whoever had done this was planning to do the same to other hikers? What if I was the next target? I decided to explore the rest of the camp more carefully, looking for evidence of what had happened here and who might be responsible. But this time, I'd be prepared for what I might find. Armed with my flashlight and my camping knife, a tool that suddenly felt inadequate as a defensive weapon, I began a systematic investigation of the rest of Blackwood Camp. If I was going to stay here overnight, and leaving immediately seemed equally dangerous given that it would soon be completely dark, I needed to understand the full extent of what had happened. The main lodge turned out to contain additional evidence of what had clearly been more than just 2 accidental deaths. Inside, I found what appeared to be a kind of improvised studio, a wooden table that had been meticulously cleaned and organized with tools that made my stomach churn as I recognized their purpose. There were knives of various sizes, all clean but showing evidence of recent use. There were jars of what looked like natural dyes made from berries and other forest plants. There were even instruments I couldn't immediately identify but that had clearly been modified for specific purposes. Pliers that had been sharpened, needles that had been elongated, metal objects that had been bent into specific shapes. In a corner of the lodge, there was a collection of books that provided unsettling insight into the mindset of whoever had been operating here. They weren't just wilderness survival manuals or camping guides. There were texts on embalming, tissue preservation, and even what appeared to be antique medical manuals on human anatomy. But the most disturbing find was a handwritten notebook I found on the table next to the tools. It was filled with detailed notes written in meticulous handwriting that documented what had clearly been a systematic process of experimentation on human bodies. The entries described techniques for preserving facial features after death, methods for maintaining limb flexibility through chemical injection, and even step-by-step instructions for applying cosmetics to corpses in ways that made them appear alive. One passage I managed to read before my stomach forced me to close the notebook described the process of creating permanent expressions of happiness in post-mortem subjects through careful manipulation of facial muscles and application of natural adhesives. It was like reading the notes of a mad scientist, except the subjects had been real people. I also found evidence that the 2 victims in the 3rd cabin hadn't been the first. In a wooden box under the table, there were personal items that clearly belonged to multiple individuals: driver's licenses, wallets, jewelry, and even family photographs. I counted at least 8 different driver's licenses, all from people between 20 and 40 years old, all with photographs showing healthy individuals who had come to these woods for recreation and never returned home. The dates on the licenses spanned a period of nearly 2 years, suggesting that whoever was responsible for this had been operating here for a considerable time, luring victims to the remote camp and conducting their grotesque experiments in relative isolation. But what truly terrified me was the date on the most recent license, just 3 days before my arrival. That meant the 2 victims in the 3rd cabin had been killed very recently, and that whoever had killed them might still be in the immediate area. It also meant that my arrival at the camp hadn't been a coincidence. If the killer had been luring victims here for 2 years, then they likely had specific methods for identifying and directing potential targets to Blackwood Camp. As I processed these terrifying realizations, I heard a sound that made me freeze completely: footsteps. Someone was walking along the trail leading to the main camp area, moving slowly but deliberately toward where I was investigating the main lodge. The footsteps didn't sound like someone trying to be stealthy. They sounded like someone who knew exactly where they were going and had every right to be there. I immediately turned off my flashlight and moved to a window in the lodge from where I could observe the trail without being seen. The evening light was fading quickly, but there was still enough illumination to see figures moving among the trees. What I saw made me realize my situation was far worse than I'd thought. Through the lodge window, I could see a figure moving along the camp's main trail. It was a middle-aged man, probably in his mid-40s, with a gray beard and clothing that seemed a mix of camping gear and work attire. He carried a large backpack and what appeared to be a metallic toolbox. What made me realize I was in immediate mortal danger wasn't his appearance, which was entirely ordinary, but his behavior. He moved through the camp with the familiarity of someone who had been there many times before, checking each cabin methodically as someone might inspect their own property. He was also singing softly to himself as he walked, a melody I couldn't identify but that sounded vaguely like a lullaby. In the forest silence, his singing carried clearly, and there was something deeply disturbing about hearing that innocent melody in a place where I'd found evidence of multiple murders. When he reached the second cabin, where I'd found evidence of recent occupation, he stopped and began organizing the items that had been scattered across the floor. His movements were efficient and practiced, as if he'd done this many times before. That's when I realized what I was truly witnessing. This man wasn't just the killer returning to the crime scene. He was someone who lived here, who had turned Blackwood Camp into his permanent residence and operational base. After organizing the second cabin, he moved toward the third cabin, where the bodies were. Through the window, I could see him enter the structure, and even from a distance, I could hear his voice as he apparently spoke to the corpses. "Hello, my dears," I could hear him say in an affectionate tone. "How have you been today? Had any visitors?" The one-sided conversation continued for several minutes, with the man apparently asking the corpses about their day and telling them about his own activities. It was like listening to someone talk to beloved pets, except the pets were murder victims he'd preserved for his companionship. When he finally emerged from the third cabin, he headed directly toward the main lodge, where I was hiding. There was no time to flee without being seen, and there were no back exits from the lodge I could use to escape without exposing myself. My only option was to hide inside the structure and hope he didn't investigate too thoroughly. I moved to the darkest corner of the lodge, behind a pile of supplies and old furniture, and tried to control my breathing as I listened to his footsteps approaching the door. "Interesting," I heard him mutter from outside. "Someone's been in my workshop." The fact that he'd immediately noticed someone had been in the lodge made me realize how meticulous he was about maintaining his operation. He probably had specific systems for detecting intrusion, ways to know exactly how he'd left every item and tool. When he entered the lodge, I could hear him moving methodically through the space, checking each area where I'd been investigating. His movements were calm and deliberate, like someone accustomed to handling unexpected situations. "Someone very curious," he muttered to himself. "Someone who appreciated my work enough to take time to study it properly." He approached the area where I'd been reading the notebook, and I could hear him rearranging the items I'd moved. "But someone who's still here," he continued. "Someone who's probably hiding very close by, wondering what to do next." My blood ran cold as I realized he knew I was in the area, possibly even in the lodge with him. "Don't worry," he said in a voice that was unnervingly soothing. "I have no intention of hurting you immediately. I prefer to get to know my new friends before deciding what to do with them." He moved to the center of the lodge and began lighting a kerosene lamp, filling the space with a flickering yellow light that made the shadows dance in ways that were deeply unsettling. "My name is Thomas," he continued, conversing as if addressing a welcomed guest. "Thomas Millfield. I've been living here at the camp for about 2.5 years. It's a wonderful place for my work." He sat at a chair near the table where he'd organized his tools, positioning himself so he had a view of the entire lodge, including the area where I was hiding. "Do you know what kind of work I do?" he asked, clearly addressing me, though pretending this was a casual conversation. "I'm an artist who works with the most challenging and rewarding medium possible. The human form," Thomas began, meticulously cleaning his tools as he spoke, each movement precise and practiced. "Most people don't understand the beauty of death," he continued. "They see decay, termination, loss. But I see opportunity. I see the chance to preserve perfect moments of peace and happiness for eternity. My friends in the third cabin," he said, gesturing in that direction, "were so stressed when they arrived here. So much fear, So much anxiety about their jobs, their relationships, their futures. But now they're completely at peace, completely happy, forever. The casual way he described murder as an act of kindness made me realize I was dealing with someone who was deeply mentally ill, but had completely rationalized their actions. "But I'm being rude," Thomas said suddenly, standing from his chair. "I have a guest, and I haven't offered proper hospitality." He began walking directly toward my hiding spot. "Please come out from there," Thomas said in a voice that was chilling in its cordiality. "It's awkward to have conversations through furniture." There was no point in continuing to hide. He clearly knew exactly where I was, and pretending I wasn't there would only make the situation more tense than it already was. I stood slowly from behind the pile of supplies, keeping my hands visible and trying to project a non-threatening posture. Thomas smiled when he saw me, as if we were old friends reuniting after a long separation. "There you are," he said with genuine pleasure. "Much better. Isn't it more civilized when we can see each other's faces while we talk?" Thomas was smaller than he'd appeared from a distance, maybe 5 feet 9 inches, with a slight build that suggested he wasn't particularly physically strong, but there was an intensity in his eyes that made me realize physical strength wasn't his primary tool of control. "Sit, please," he told me, gesturing toward a chair across from the table where he'd organized his tools. "I like to get to know people before deciding how to proceed." "I'm not going to sit," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Of course you will," Thomas replied, with a calm that was more terrifying than if he'd shouted. "Because the alternative is that we do this in a much less pleasant way." He picked up one of the knives from the table, not in a threatening manner, but as someone might pick up a familiar tool to examine it. "This is my favorite," he explained casually. "Very sharp, very precise, perfect for detailed work." I sat. "Excellent," Thomas said, lowering the knife but keeping it within reach. "Now we can have a proper conversation." "What do you want from me?" I asked. "I want to get to know you," Thomas replied. "What's your name? What brought you to Blackwood Camp? Do you have family who'll be expecting you?" The last question was clearly the most important to him. He was assessing whether my disappearance would be noticed quickly. "Derek," I said, deciding that partial honesty might be my best strategy. "I came here for a solo camping weekend." "Alone?" Thomas asked with obvious interest. "No one knows exactly where you are." "My office knows I'm in the area," I lied. "If I don't show up Monday, they'll send people looking for me." "Your office?" Thomas repeated. "What kind of work do you do?" "Systems analysis," I replied, hoping it sounded technical and boring enough to disinterest him. "Fascinating," Thomas said, though he clearly wasn't fascinated. "A very stressful job, I imagine. Lots of pressure, lots of expectations. No more than most jobs," I said. "Oh, but I think you're underestimating the emotional toll of your career," Thomas continued. "All that time in front of computers, all that responsibility for systems other people rely on. It must be exhausting." There was something about the way he was steering the conversation that made me realize he was building toward something, possibly a justification for whatever he was planning to do to me. "Do you have a girlfriend?" Thomas asked. "Wife? Kids?" "No," I admitted, immediately regretting providing that information. "How lonely that must be," Thomas observed with false sympathy. "All those hours working on complex technical problems, then going home to an empty apartment every night." "I'm fine with my life," I said firmly. "Really?" Thomas asked. "Is that why you came here alone? To escape a life that's fine?" Thomas stood from his chair and began pacing around the table, keeping a distance that wasn't directly threatening, but reminded me he controlled the situation. "Derek," he told me, "I've met many people like you during my time here. People who work jobs they don't love, who live in cities that isolate them, who come to the woods looking for something they can't name. And I've learned that most of these people are actually looking for peace," he continued. "They're looking for a way to escape the constant stress, the anxiety, the pressure of pretending they're happy when they're really suffering." "I'm not suffering," I protested. Of course you are, Thomas said with unsettling certainty. Everyone suffers, Derek. But most people never find a way to escape their suffering. He stopped directly in front of me, close enough that I could see the details of his face in the lamplight. His eyes had an intensity that was entirely unnatural, like someone who had been operating in alternate realities for so long they'd lost touch with basic social norms. I can free you from your suffering, he told me with the sincerity of someone offering a genuine gift. I don't want to be freed, I said, trying to stand from the chair. Sit, Thomas ordered, and this time the command had an edge that made me realize the cordial phase of our conversation was ending. Derek, I'm going to explain exactly what's going to happen, he continued. You're going to let me help you find permanent peace. And in return, I'll preserve you in a state of perfect happiness that will last forever. You're going to make me one of your friends, I said, my voice beginning to shake. Exactly, Thomas confirmed, but only after we understand each other completely. Only after we've explored together all the reasons why this is truly what's best for you. Thomas returned to his seat and began arranging his tools in specific patterns, like a surgeon preparing for an operation. The process takes time, he explained. We can make it take a long time or a short time, depending on how cooperative you are. How long did it take with the two people in the other cabin? I asked. Oh, they were very resistant at first, Thomas replied with a smile that held no warmth, especially the woman. Kept insisting she had a wonderful life waiting for her at home, that she was happy, that she didn't need my help. But she eventually understood, he asked, as if genuinely interested in my opinion of his previous work. I didn't respond, but Thomas continued anyway. In the end, everyone understands, he assured me. Once they realize that resistance only makes the process slower and more painful, they usually cooperate much better. But what I really enjoy, Thomas continued, now fully absorbed in arranging his tools, are the conversations we have during the process. People say the most honest things when they realize they no longer have to pretend. He looked up at me with an expression of genuine anticipation. I'm really looking forward to our conversations, Derek. For the next 30 minutes, Thomas continued meticulously preparing his tools while maintaining a one-sided conversation about his philosophy and previous experiences with other people he'd helped. Each detail he shared made me realize more clearly that I was dealing with someone who had completely rationalized a series of torturous murders as acts of kindness. But I also realized that Thomas was arrogant about his control of the situation. He'd been operating in this remote area for so long, had been so successful at luring isolated victims to the camp, that he'd developed an overconfidence about his ability to handle any resistance. That arrogance was my only advantage. While Thomas arranged a syringe and several vials of liquids that were presumably sedatives or poisons, I began carefully assessing my escape options. The lodge had a main door and two windows, one of which was directly behind Thomas. If I could create a significant enough distraction, I might be able to reach one of the windows before he could react. But I also knew that even if I managed to get out of the lodge, I'd be fleeing through unfamiliar woods in the dark, pursued by someone who knew the terrain intimately and had experience hunting people trying to escape. Do you know what's most interesting about fear, Derek? Thomas asked as he filled the syringe with a clear liquid. What? I managed to reply. That it's completely unnecessary once you understand that the bad things you fear are going to happen no matter what you do, he explained with the patience of a teacher. Once you accept the inevitable, you can just relax and experience what comes next. Thomas stood with the syringe in one hand and a cloth in the other. This will make you sleep, he explained, and when you wake up, we'll be ready to begin our real work together. Thomas, I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt, before we do this, can I ask you something about your process? He paused, clearly interested in discussing his work. Of course, he replied. I'm always willing to educate people about what I do. How do you preserve the bodies to look so alive? I asked. Thomas smiled with genuine pride. That's the most technical part of my work," he explained. "It requires a combination of traditional embalming techniques with some innovations I've developed specifically for forest conditions." As he began explaining the details of his preservation process, I slowly stood from my chair, pretending to be fascinated by his technical explanation. "Traditional chemicals don't work well in humid environments like this," he continued, gesturing with the syringe as he spoke. "So I've had to experiment with natural preservatives I can make from forest plants." When he was about 3 feet away from me, I feigned a slight stumble forward, as if I'd lost my balance out of fear. Thomas instinctively reached out with his free hand to steady me. In that moment, I grabbed the kerosene lamp from the table and threw it directly at the wooden wall of the lodge. The glass shattered with a loud crash, and the burning kerosene immediately spread across the dry wall, creating a curtain of flames that blocked half the lodge and made Thomas instinctively step back. In the confusion, I ran to the nearest window and threw myself through the glass, feeling shards cut into my face and arms as I landed heavily on the ground outside the lodge. Behind me, I could hear Thomas shouting, not in pain, but in anger, as he tried to control the fire spreading rapidly through the dry wooden structure. I didn't stop to assess my injuries. I ran into the woods as fast as my legs could carry me, using the light of the growing fire to navigate through the first 100 meters of trees before darkness swallowed me completely. Running through dense forest in complete darkness is an experience you can't prepare for. Every step is a gamble against hidden roots, low branches, and holes that could snap an ankle or send you headfirst into unseen rocks. But when you're being pursued by a serial killer who knows every tree and trail in the area, the alternative to running is far worse than any injury you might sustain from stumbling. For the first few minutes after my escape from the burning lodge, I focused simply on putting distance between Thomas and me. I could hear activity behind me, shouts, the sound of someone trying to salvage equipment from the burning lodge, even what sounded like elaborate curses about the damage to his workshop. But after about 10 minutes of running blindly through the woods, I heard something that made me realize my escape had only been temporarily successful. The sound of someone moving through the forest behind me with far more skill and speed than I could muster. Thomas was following me, and he had a flashlight. I could see the beam of light swinging through the trees behind me, occasionally illuminating my back when the terrain opened enough to allow longer lines of sight. The light was steadily getting closer, which meant he was moving through the woods considerably faster than I was. "Derek," I heard him shout from the distance. "It doesn't have to be this way. You can make it easy for both of us if you just stop and we talk." His voice was remarkably calm considering I'd just escaped him by burning down his base of operations. It was as if this were merely a minor inconvenience rather than a real threat to his control of the situation. "I know these woods better than anyone," he shouted. "There's no way you'll make it back to your car without my help." He was right, I realized with growing panic. In my rush to escape, I hadn't paid attention to maintaining my orientation. I had no idea which direction the trail to the parking lot was, and in the complete darkness of the forest, every direction looked identical. But continuing to move was my only option. Stopping would mean capture, and capture would mean becoming Thomas's next friend at Blackwood Camp. For the next hour, I developed a pattern of movement that maximized my distance from Thomas while minimizing the noise I made. I moved slowly and deliberately for periods of 5 to 10 minutes, then stopped to listen for his location, then moved again in a different direction. The strategy was that even if I couldn't escape the forest immediately, I could make finding me so difficult that he'd eventually give up and return to the camp to deal with the damage I'd caused. But it gradually became clear that Thomas wasn't going to give up. His voice continued to come through the forest at regular intervals, sometimes closer, sometimes farther, but always present. "Derek, you're making this much harder than it needs to be," he shouted occasionally. "When I find you, and I will find you, your resistance is only going to make the process more unpleasant." Around midnight, After hours of this cat and mouse chase through the woods, I found myself in an area where the tree canopy opened enough to allow some moonlight. For the first time since my escape, I could see well enough to assess my surroundings in more detail. I was in a sort of natural clearing, possibly an area where a large tree had fallen years ago and created a gap in the forest canopy. There was a small stream running through the clearing, and several fallen logs that could provide cover if I needed to hide. But I also realized that there was evidence of human activity in this clearing. There were marks on some of the trees that looked like trailblazes, and even what appeared to be a small shelter constructed from branches and leaves on one side of the open area. That's when I understood where I was. I'd stumbled into another of Thomas's sites. The shelter wasn't just a random structure built by casual campers. It was too well constructed, too permanent. And when I approached to examine it more closely, I could see that there were items stored inside: canned food, basic tools, and even what looked like medical equipment. Thomas had established multiple locations throughout these woods, likely as part of his system for hunting and controlling victims. He could use these shelters as staging points, places to store supplies, or even alternate locations to conduct his work if the main camp was compromised, which meant he might be herding me toward this area specifically, using my escape to guide me to a place where he'd have even more advantages. "Derek," his voice came from the woods, now clearly closer than before. "I see you found one of my work shelters. Useful, isn't it?" He knew exactly where I was. The shelter Thomas had built in the clearing was more elaborate than it had initially appeared. Upon closer inspection in the dim moonlight, I could see it was essentially a small, semi-permanent structure built from logs, branches, and even some pieces of corrugated metal, likely brought from the main camp. Inside the shelter, the supplies I'd seen were even more unsettling up close. There were tools that had clearly been modified for specific purposes, chemicals in hand-labeled jars, and even what looked like detailed documentation of previous activities at this site. In a wooden box, I found another notebook similar to the one I'd seen at the main camp. This one was filled with diagrams showing the layout of the surrounding forest, marking trails, additional shelters, and even what appeared to be locations where he'd processed previous victims. According to the diagrams, Thomas had effectively turned several thousand acres of national forest into his personal hunting territory, with multiple installations designed for different aspects of his operation. The main camp was where he lured victims and conducted his primary work, but he had at least 6 satellite shelters scattered throughout the area for various support purposes. The most disturbing were the notes accompanying the diagrams. They described in detail how he'd used the natural terrain to trap and control victims, including areas where the landscape made escape difficult and locations where he'd built hidden barriers to channel fleeing individuals toward areas where he could capture them more easily. I realized my escape from the main camp might have been exactly what Thomas wanted to happen. I'd burned down a structure he could likely rebuild in days, and in return, I'd revealed detailed information about my physical capabilities, my mental endurance, and my decision-making patterns under extreme stress. "Derek," his voice came from the edge of the clearing, now so close he could likely see me if he had night vision equipment. "I hope you're enjoying my library. I've meticulously documented all my work over the past few years." He was approaching slowly, but not in a way that suggested haste or panic. It was more like someone approaching a cornered animal, taking their time to ensure no mistakes in the final capture. "Have you read about my other guests?" he continued. "Some of them ran just as far as you, but eventually they all found their way back to me. Reviewing the notebook had been a mistake. I'd used valuable time that I could have spent continuing to flee, and now Thomas was close enough that direct escape was virtually impossible. But the documentation had also given me information about the forest's layout that could be useful. According to his diagrams, there was a forest road about 3.5 kilometers northeast of the clearing, a road that could lead me back to civilization if I could reach it. The problem was that Thomas had specifically noted that road as a common escape route that must be monitored during active operations. He'd even marked locations along the route where he'd built hidden observation points. But he'd also noted a terrain feature that might give me an advantage: a series of narrow ravines running through the area between the clearing and the road. The ravines were too narrow for easy navigation, but according to his notes, they were one of the few areas where he'd had difficulty tracking previous victims. If I could reach the ravines and navigate through them without making enough noise to reveal my location, I might be able to avoid Thomas's observation points and reach the road. "Derek, I know you're reading my notes," Thomas shouted, now clearly within the clearing but still not visible from my position inside the shelter. "Aren't you impressed by the organization? I've turned this into a real science." I silently replaced the notebook in the box and began moving toward the back of the shelter, where I'd seen an opening leading toward the ravine area. "Most people don't understand the planning this kind of work requires," Thomas continued. "But someone with your technical background probably can appreciate the level of systematic detail." He was clearly trying to keep me talking, possibly to pinpoint my exact location within the shelter before approaching. I managed to exit the back of the shelter without making significant noise and began moving toward the area where his diagrams indicated the ravines began. But the terrain in that direction was even more challenging than I'd expected: steep, rocky, and covered with vegetation that was nearly impossible to navigate quietly. "Derek," Thomas's voice suddenly shifted from conversational to commanding. "Come out of the shelter immediately. I can see exactly where you are, and hiding is only delaying the inevitable." He'd reached the shelter and apparently realized I was no longer inside. For the next few minutes, I could hear him moving around the perimeter of the clearing, using his flashlight to examine the area for signs of where I'd gone. Occasionally, the beam of light passed over my location, and I had to freeze completely to avoid detection. "The ravine area," I heard him shout finally. Of course, they always try to get to the ravines. The fact that he'd identified my escape route suggested he'd experienced this before with other victims, and that he'd developed specific counter strategies for dealing with people trying to use the difficult terrain to escape. But I had no other options. I continued moving toward the ravine area, hoping that his previous difficulty tracking victims in that region might give me the edge I needed to reach the road. What I hadn't anticipated was that Thomas had learned from those previous experiences and had modified his approach. Instead of following me into the ravines, where the terrain would give him the same disadvantages it gave me, he moved in a different direction toward one of his other shelters that, according to his documentation, was positioned to intercept anyone trying to navigate through the ravine system. He was herding me into a trap. The ravines turned out to be even more challenging to navigate than I'd expected. They were essentially deep fractures in the forest terrain, likely created by water runoff during periods of heavy rain. They ranged from 4 to 8 feet deep, with earthen and rock walls that were slippery and unstable. Moving through them required slow, careful progression, feeling out each step before committing my weight. But they also provided excellent cover. Once I was at the bottom of a ravine, I was virtually invisible from above, and the sound of any movement was significantly muffled. For the first half hour of navigating through the ravine system, I began to feel cautious optimism. I hadn't heard Thomas during that time, and I'd managed to make steady progress toward the area where his diagrams indicated the road was. But then I reached a point where the ravine I'd been following forked in 2 different directions. According to my recollection of Thomas's diagrams, the right-hand route led more directly to the road, but the left-hand route was longer but possibly safer. As I tried to decide which direction to take, I heard a sound that made me realize Thomas had been closer than I'd thought. The distinctive crack of a dry branch being stepped on, coming from directly above my location. "Derek," his voice came from above, startlingly close. "I know you're down there. The ravines are great for hiding, but terrible for quick escape." I moved silently to the left, choosing the longer route in hopes that Thomas couldn't determine exactly which direction I'd taken. Did you know I've been using these ravines for years? Thomas continued conversationally. At first, they used to be a real problem for me. People would hide in them for hours. His voice was moving, keeping roughly above my location as I navigated through the ravine. He'd clearly developed techniques for tracking people through the system without having to descend himself. But then I realized the ravines have a predictable pattern, he explained. There are only 3 main routes through them, and they all lead to locations I can monitor. This information made me realize I'd made exactly the mistake Thomas had been hoping for. Instead of using the ravines to escape, I'd use them to trap myself in a system he understood completely. The route you're taking leads directly to one of my special shelters, Thomas continued. A place where I can take all the time I need for our work without worrying about interruptions. I tried to change direction, but the ravine's layout made backtracking extremely difficult. The walls were too steep to climb easily, and the ravine floor was barely wide enough for one person, making turning around nearly impossible. I realized Thomas had identified this terrain feature and had been systematically using it to channel victims toward locations where he had absolute control. After another 20 minutes of slow movement through the ravine, I reached an area where the system opened into a small clearing. It was clearly the special shelter Thomas had referred to, an area that had been extensively modified to serve as a capture site. The clearing had only one exit, the ravine through which I'd arrived. The other directions were blocked by natural barriers, steep rock walls, dense vegetation, and even what appeared to be man-made constructions designed to prevent escape. In the center of the clearing there was another structure, but this one was different from the shelters I'd seen before. It was smaller, more robust, and had features that had clearly been designed to contain people against their will. "Welcome to my private studio." Thomas's voice came from the edge of the clearing. "This is where I do my best work." Thomas appeared at the ravine opening behind me, effectively blocking my only escape route. In the limited light, I could see he was carrying more equipment than he'd had before. A larger backpack, additional tools, and even what looked like a tranquilizer gun. "It's been an excellent chase," he told me with genuine enthusiasm. "You've really tested my systems in a helpful way." "Was this all a game to you?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of exhaustion and terror. "Of course," Thomas replied. "The chase is one of the most educational parts of the process. It tells me so much about someone's personality, their survival instincts, their creativity under pressure." Thomas began approaching slowly, keeping the tranquilizer gun trained on me. "And you've been particularly instructive," he continued. "Most people would have completely panicked after finding my friends at the camp, but you investigated, asked questions, even had the presence of mind to create a distraction. That tells me you have a strong character," he explained, "and strong characters make the best subjects for my work. There's so much more interesting to converse with during the process." I realized this conversation was possibly my last chance to find a way to escape. Once Thomas sedated me with the tranquilizer gun, I'd be completely defenseless against whatever he had planned. "Thomas," I said, trying to project more calm than I felt, "before we do this, can I ask you about something I found in your notes?" He paused, clearly intrigued. "Of course," he replied. "I'm always willing to discuss technical aspects of my work." "Your diagrams showed multiple shelters, but I only saw detailed documentation for a few of them," I said, improvising desperately. "How many sites are you actually operating?" "Excellent question," Thomas said with pride. "I currently have 11 operational installations spread across about 35 square kilometers of forest." As he began enthusiastically describing his network of shelters, I started moving very gradually toward one side of the clearing, where I'd noticed what looked like a pile of loose rocks. "Each shelter has a specialized purpose," Thomas continued. "Some are for storage, some for observation, some for specific technical work." "How do you maintain all the sites?" I asked, continuing my slow movement toward the rocks. "It's a full-time job," Thomas admitted, "but very rewarding. I've turned this entire area into a perfect laboratory for studying human behavior under extreme stress. When I reached the pile of rocks, I could see that some of them were large and loose enough to use as projectiles. If I could distract Thomas enough to close the distance between us, I might be able to take control of the tranquilizer gun. "Your most impressive operation," I said, crouching as if admiring something on the ground, "is how you've avoided detection for so long." "Oh, that requires very careful planning," Thomas replied, clearly enjoying the chance to boast about his work. "I have specific systems for dealing with authorities, contingency plans for multiple scenarios." As I picked up a rock the size of a baseball, Thomas finally noticed what I was doing. "Derek," he warned, raising the tranquilizer gun, "don't do something stupid. We can do this the easy way." "Not anymore," I said, and threw the rock directly at his head. The rock I threw at Thomas didn't hit him directly, but it struck him hard enough in the shoulder to make him lose his grip on the tranquilizer gun. The weapon fell to the ground between us, and we both moved toward it simultaneously. Thomas was smaller than me, but he was also considerably faster and more experienced in physical combat. He reached the gun first, but as he crouched to pick it up, I managed to tackle him from the side, sending us both rolling across the rocky ground of the clearing. The fight that followed was brutal and desperate. Thomas fought with the intensity of someone who had been in life-or-death situations multiple times before, using techniques he'd clearly learned through experience. But I was fighting with the adrenaline of someone who knew this was literally my last chance to survive. For the first few seconds of the struggle, Thomas maintained a clear advantage. He was more skilled, more calculated, and knew exactly how to use the clearing's terrain to his advantage. But gradually, my size and weight advantage began to matter. I managed to gain control of the tranquilizer gun and threw it out of the clearing, where it smashed against the rocks and clearly broke. That eliminated the immediate threat of being sedated, but Thomas still had access to other equipment in his backpack. "You're making this worse for both of us," Thomas shouted as we struggled. "All you're doing is ensuring the process will be more painful." But there was something different in his voice now. For the first time since I'd met him, he sounded genuinely frustrated rather than controlled and confident. His carefully orchestrated plan had unraveled, and he didn't know exactly how to handle sustained resistance. I managed to land a solid punch to his solar plexus that left him temporarily winded, and I used that opportunity to break away from the clearing toward one of the rock walls I'd thought blocked escape. Up close, I could see that what had appeared to be a solid wall was actually a talus slope of loose rocks that had been partially stabilized but could be climbable with enough determination. I began climbing, ignoring the pain of sharp rocks cutting into my hands and the sound of Thomas recovering behind me. "You can't climb that," he shouted. "I've seen other people try it. You're just going to fall and hurt yourself." But desperation gave me strength and coordination I didn't know I had. I managed to climb about 15 feet before the rocks became too unstable to support my weight. But that was enough to reach a ledge where I could find more solid handholds in the natural rock. From below, I could hear Thomas trying to follow me, but his lighter weight worked against him in this kind of climbing. The rocks that had held my weight shifted under him, sending him back to the bottom of the clearing with a shower of rocky debris. "Derek," he shouted, now with real anger in his voice, "when you come down from there, and you will come down, this is going to be so much worse for you." But I kept climbing. After another 20 minutes of slow, painful progress, I reached the top of the talus slope and could see I'd emerged into a completely different area of the forest. From this elevated perspective, I could even see lights in the distance that might have been the road I'd been trying to reach. Thomas was still shouting threats from below, but his voice was fading as I put distance between us. I could also hear that he was having difficulty navigating out of the clearing, possibly because he'd designed the area so well to trap victims that even he had trouble escaping quickly. For the next 2 hours, I made my way through the forest toward the lights I'd seen. The terrain was more navigable at this elevation, and I eventually found what appeared to be a maintained hiking trail that led in the right direction. At 4:30 in the morning, I emerged onto a paved forest road. 20 minutes later, an early morning truck driver stopped to pick me up after seeing my obviously desperate condition. "Jesus, man," he said as I climbed into his cab. "What happened to you? Did you have an accident?" "I need to get to the police," I managed to say. "There's a killer in the woods." Multiple victims. The truck driver took me directly to the nearest police station, where I spent the next 8 hours providing detailed statements to investigators about everything I'd witnessed at Blackwood Camp. The investigation that followed my report found evidence of at least 15 different victims across the 11 shelters Thomas had established throughout the National Forest, confirming he'd been operating as a serial killer for over 2 years. Thomas Millfield, whose real name turned out to be Thomas Gregory Millman, was never caught. When investigative teams reached Blackwood Camp, they found extensive evidence of his activities, but no sign of his current whereabouts. He had apparently activated contingency plans he'd been developing for years, including emergency shelters and escape routes that allowed him to disappear into even more remote areas of the National Forest. Investigators found the bodies of the 2 victims I'd seen in the 3rd cabin, as well as remains of 13 additional victims in various satellite shelters. Each site showed evidence of the same pattern of psychological torture, followed by murder and preservation I had witnessed. But they also found evidence that Thomas had been meticulously documenting every aspect of his crimes. His notebooks contained detailed information not only about his methods, but also about how he'd identified and lured victims to the area. He'd been monitoring hiking websites, social media groups for outdoor activities, and even campground registries to identify people traveling alone in remote areas. My experience had been typical of his operating method: identify someone planning a solo trip, research them extensively before their arrival, then use the camp's isolation to control their experience completely from the moment they arrived. Detective Sarah Morrison, who led the investigation, contacts me occasionally with updates on efforts to locate Thomas. There have been possible sightings in multiple national forests across the West, and evidence of similar activity in remote locations in Oregon, Washington, and even Alaska. He's someone who's learned to use the vastness of the National Forest System as his personal territory, Morrison explained during our last conversation. There are literally millions of acres where he could set up similar operations without detection. "Do you think you'll ever catch him?" I asked. "Eventually," she replied, though she didn't sound entirely certain. "But it could take years. These guys who operate in remote areas can be incredibly hard to track." What haunts me most isn't the fear of Thomas specifically, though that fear is ever present, but the realization that there are vast areas of the country where people like him can operate with virtual impunity. National forests, by their very nature, provide the perfect environment for predators who've learned to use isolation and remote terrain as weapons. I've also learned that Thomas wasn't unique. The investigation into his activities led to connections with similar unsolved cases in multiple states, suggesting a broader network of individuals who've discovered how to use remote public lands as sites for violent crimes. I no longer go camping alone. In fact, I no longer go camping at all. The experience completely destroyed my ability to find peace in remote natural environments, replacing what was once a source of relaxation with constant hypervigilance about potential threats. I write this as a warning to others who might be considering solo trips to remote areas. Not because I believe every forest is filled with serial killers, but because my experience taught me that when they're there, they can be nearly impossible to detect until it's too late. Thomas had spent 2 years turning Blackwood Camp and the surrounding area into a perfect trap for people seeking solitude in the wilderness. He'd studied the behavior of solo hikers, identified their vulnerabilities, and created systems that exploited those vulnerabilities with scientific precision. If he hadn't made the mistake of wanting to converse with me before proceeding with his usual process, If he had simply used sedatives immediately, I never would have had the chance to escape, and my disappearance would have been just another addition to the statistics of people who go missing in national forests every year and are never found. Forests can be beautiful places, places of peace and renewal, but they can also be places where the most sophisticated human predators choose to operate, knowing they have every advantage on the terrain where most people don't understand and where help can be days away. The next time you consider a solo trip to a remote area, remember that you might not be as alone as you think, and the most dangerous people are often those who seem perfectly normal until it's too late to protect yourself. Thomas Millman is still out there, somewhere, possibly setting up operations in a new remote forest, studying the routes of new potential victims, perfecting his methods. And the next person who stumbles into one of his camps might not be as lucky as I was. I arrived at Tall Pines Camp hoping to find the peace I so desperately needed. After months of work stress and a recent divorce, I had booked a cabin for 2 weeks in this remote mountain retreat. The camp was 3 hours from the nearest city, surrounded by dense pine forests that stretched as far as the eye could see. The receptionist, an older woman with tired eyes, handed me the keys to cabin number 7 with little conversation. "It's pretty isolated," she warned, "but I guess that's what you're looking for." She was right. Solitude was exactly what I needed. My cabin was located at the eastern edge of the camp, separated from the others by at least 200 meters of forest. It was a rustic but comfortable structure with a small kitchen, a living room with a fireplace, and a bedroom with windows overlooking the woods. What I liked most was the back porch, which offered a view of a small clearing among the trees. That first afternoon, while unpacking my things, I felt an odd sensation for the first time. It was as if someone was watching me. I stopped in the middle of hanging my shirts in the closet and looked toward the window. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, casting dancing shadows, but I saw nothing unusual. Just nerves, I told myself. It was natural to feel a bit paranoid in such an isolated place after being used to the constant noise of the city. That night, I lit the fireplace and settled in with a book and a glass of wine. The silence was almost absolute, broken only by the occasional crackle of branches or the distant hoot of an owl. That's when I heard it for the first time, the sound of footsteps on dry leaves outside. I froze, straining my ears. The steps were slow and deliberate, as if someone were walking in circles around the cabin. My heart began to race. I cautiously approached the window and looked out, but the darkness was impenetrable. The footsteps stopped. I waited several minutes in silence, but they didn't resume. It was probably an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. I went to bed trying to convince myself it was just my imagination working overtime. I woke up early, feeling like I hadn't slept well. I'd had restless dreams filled with shadows and whispers. While making coffee, I noticed something that stopped me cold: footprints in the mud in front of my porch. I stepped closer to examine them. They were definitely human boot prints, not animal tracks. Someone had been standing there, right in front of my bedroom windows. The prints formed a semicircle, as if the person had lingered there for a considerable time, pacing back and forth. My first instinct was to go to the reception, but something stopped me. What would I say? That there were footprints outside my cabin. They could belong to maintenance or a previous guest. I had no proof anything sinister was happening. I decided to explore the camp during the day. There were 12 other cabins spread across an area of about 2 square kilometers. Most seemed empty. It was the off-season, and the place was practically deserted. I only saw 2 families with young children near the artificial lake in the center of the camp, and an older man fishing from the dock. It was during my walk that I saw him for the first time. I was hiking along a trail leading to a lookout point when I felt that familiar sensation of being watched. I turned around, and among the trees about 50 meters away, saw a figure. It was hard to make out details due to the shadows, but it seemed to be a tall man dressed in dark clothing. He stood completely still, like a statue. "Hello," I shouted, raising my hand in a friendly wave. The figure didn't respond. He didn't even move. I started walking toward him, but when I looked away for a second to avoid a low branch, he vanished. I searched among the trees, but there was no trace of him. That night, I reinforced my security routine. I locked all the windows and drew the curtains before dark. I propped a chair against the front door and kept all the interior lights on. But even so, around 2 in the morning, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. It was the sound of someone trying the back door, slowly turning the knob. My heart pounded so hard, I feared whoever was outside might hear it. The sound stopped, but then I heard something much worse. The slow, deliberate scratching of nails or some sharp object against the wooden door. It was methodical, almost musical in its steady rhythm. I grabbed my phone to call reception, but there was no signal. I remembered that coverage was spotty in the camp, especially at night. The scratching continued for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. Then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I waited until dawn before daring to look outside. On the back door, I found 5 parallel lines carved into the wood, as if someone had scratched the surface with their nails. They were deep and fresh. The lack of sleep was starting to get to me. I felt constantly on edge, jumping at every sound. I decided to go to reception to report the incidents, but when I got there, I found a note taped to the door. Family emergency. Back on Monday, Maria. It was Friday. I'd be alone in the camp for the entire weekend. The idea of staying alone filled me with panic, but leaving would mean admitting I was scared of someone who might only exist in my imagination. I decided to stay, but be more cautious. During the day, I tried to stick to open areas near the lake, where visibility was better. The families I'd seen earlier were gone, and the old fishermen had also disappeared. The camp felt abandoned, as if I were the only guest left. That's when I found the first note. It was taped to my car's windshield, written in block letters with black ink. "I've been watching you. I like you when you sleep." My hand shook as I read the message. I looked around the parking lot, but I was completely alone. Whoever left the note had done so in broad daylight, confident they wouldn't be seen. I kept the note as evidence and started walking back to my cabin, but stopped. If someone was truly stalking me, going to an isolated place would be the worst thing I could do. Instead, I decided to spend the day in the camp's main lodge, which had a common area with sofas and a library. But even there, I didn't feel safe. The windows were large and curtainless, and from the surrounding forest, someone could easily watch me without being seen. Every shadow moving among the trees made me jump. At dusk, I had no choice but to return to my cabin. Before entering, I walked around the perimeter, checking for any signs of intrusion. What I found chilled me to the bone. There were more footprints, but these were different. They formed a perfect circle around the entire cabin, as if someone had been walking in circles for hours. And there was something else. Small piles of stones placed strategically at the 4 cardinal points around the structure. Each pile had exactly 7 stones, stacked with precision. There was nothing natural about their arrangement. Someone had placed them there deliberately. That night, I didn't turn on any lights. I sat in the darkness of my living room, clutching a kitchen knife, waiting. If someone came, I wouldn't be an easy victim. Around midnight, it started again. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just footsteps or scratching. It was a voice. "Roberto," a voice whispered from outside. It was my name, but said in a way that made me feel sick. The voice was hoarse, almost animalistic, but definitely human. "Roberto, I know you're awake." The voice came from different directions, as if the person were moving around the cabin while speaking. "Roberto, why don't you come out to play?" I closed my eyes tightly, praying it was just my imagination. But the voice continued, getting closer to the windows. "You smell like fear, Roberto." I liked that smell. Then it started laughing. A low, drawn-out laugh that turned into a moan before becoming laughter again. The sound went on for what felt like hours. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was almost worse. I didn't sleep at all. At dawn, I was certain I needed to leave. This had gone beyond a prank or my stressed imagination. Someone was systematically stalking me, and it was escalating. But when I went to my car, I found all 4 tires had been slashed. Not punctured, slashed with something sharp, leaving long gashes in the rubber. My vehicle was completely unusable. On the windshield was another note. "You can't leave yet. The fun is just beginning." My vision blurred with panic. I was trapped in an isolated place with someone who clearly had malicious intentions. My phone still had no signal, and the receptionist wouldn't be back until Monday. I ran back to the main lodge, hoping to find a landline, but the office was locked. I tried to force the door, but it was solid and wouldn't budge. Then I remembered seeing a communications tower on a nearby hill during my initial exploration of the area. If I could get there, I might get a signal to call for help. The hike to the hill took nearly 2 hours through poorly marked trails. Several times I felt like I was being followed, but every time I turned around, I saw nothing. Still, I occasionally heard the sound of branches snapping in the distance, as if someone were trying to stay hidden among the trees. I finally reached the tower. It was a rusty metal structure about 20 meters tall. My phone showed 1 bar of signal, enough to make a call. I dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? I'm at Tall Pines Camp, and someone is stalking me. They've sabotaged my car and have me trapped here. I need help. Can you describe the nature of the stalking, sir? I told them everything. The footprints, the notes, the voice in the night, the slashed tires. As I spoke, I could hear the skepticism in the operator's voice. "We'll send a patrol to check the situation, sir. It may take 3 or 4 hours due to the remote location. 3 or 4 hours. I'd have to survive until then." On the way back, the feeling of being followed intensified. It wasn't subtle anymore. I could clearly hear footsteps behind me, always keeping the same distance. When I stopped, they stopped. When I sped up, they sped up too. Halfway back to the camp, I decided to confront it. I turned around sharply and shouted, "I know you're there. Show yourself like a man." The footsteps stopped. The forest went silent. Even the birds stopped singing. Then, from behind a large tree about 30 meters away, a figure slowly emerged. It was a tall, lanky man dressed in worn camouflage clothing. His hair was long and greasy, and he had an unkempt beard. But what disturbed me most were his eyes. Even from that distance, I could tell there was something deeply wrong with his gaze. It was intense, almost feverish, like that of a wild animal. He didn't say anything. He just stared at me, a slight crooked smile on his face. "What do you want from me?" I shouted. He tilted his head like a dog hearing a strange sound. Then, to my horror, he started walking toward me. I ran. I ran faster than I had in years, leaping over fallen logs and dodging low branches. I could hear him behind me, but he wasn't running. He kept a steady jog, as if he knew I'd eventually tire out. I reached the camp out of breath, my heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst. I headed straight for the main lodge and tried again to force the office door. This time, in desperation, I grabbed a large rock and smashed a window. Inside, I found a landline, but it was dead. I checked the connections and discovered someone had cut the wires. I was truly trapped. I spent the night in the main lodge, barricaded in the bathroom with the kitchen knife. It was the only room without windows, and the door had a strong lock. Every sound made me jump. The wind against the windows, the creaking of settling wood, the small nighttime noises of the forest. But the worst was when everything was silent, because I knew he was out there, waiting. At dawn, I cautiously left the bathroom. The lodge's windows were fogged with morning dew, but I could see footprints in the mud outside. He had been walking in circles around the building all night. I decided I had to be more aggressive. I couldn't just wait for the police. I needed to find a way to defend myself or escape. I returned to my cabin to gather tools I could use as weapons. My cabin had been violated. The door was wide open, though I remembered locking it. Inside, everything had been slightly rearranged. My books were in a different order. My clothes had been taken out of the suitcases and reorganized. My toiletries had been touched and rearranged. But the most disturbing thing was my bed. The sheets had been removed and remade, but there was something between them. I carefully lifted the blanket and found dozens of photographs. They were photos of me. Photos taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. Photos of me unpacking on the first day. Photos of me reading on the porch. Photos of me sleeping, taken through the bedroom window with some kind of night vision camera. And the most disturbing, a photo of me sitting in the bathroom the previous night, somehow taken from the ceiling. I realized with horror that he had probably been watching me through some kind of opening I hadn't noticed. On the back of each photo was a date and a handwritten comment. Day 1, beautiful when he sleeps. Day 2, he likes red wine. Day 3, he's scared, as he should be. Day 4, soon we'll be best friends. There was one final photo without a date. It was of me at that exact moment standing by the bed looking at the photographs. I was being watched in real time. I ran out of the cabin and looked toward the surrounding forest. I knew he was there, probably laughing at my terror. "Show yourself!" I screamed at the trees. "If you're going to do something, do it now." The echo of my voice faded into silence. Then, from very close by, I heard his voice. "Patience, Roberto. The best things come to those who wait." The voice came from above. I looked up at the roof of my cabin and saw him lying face down, staring at me with that same crooked smile. How long had he been there? He slid down from the roof with the agility of an animal and landed about 10 meters from me. Now that I could see him clearly, I realized how tall he really was. He stood at least 2 meters, and beneath his dirty clothes I could make out muscles honed by years of outdoor life. "Hello, Roberto," he said in that hoarse voice I'd heard whispering in the dark. "I've been waiting so long to meet you properly." "What do you want from me?" I managed to say, though my voice sounded strange and high-pitched. "I want to play," he replied, and his smile widened, revealing yellowed, uneven teeth. "I've been very lonely in these woods." "I need a friend. The police are on their way," I lied. "No, they're not," he said, shaking his head slowly from side to side. "I cut the phone lines days ago. And that cell phone of yours, well, let's just say I have a little signal jammer that keeps things private between us." He pulled a small electronic device from his pocket. A cell phone signal jammer. He wasn't some crazy vagrant. He had planned this meticulously. "Who are you?" I asked. "You can call me Eddie," he said. "I've been living in these woods for... Oh, how long has it been?" I lose track, but I love it when visitors come. Especially visitors who stay alone for a long time. What happened to the other visitors? His smile faded for a moment, replaced by an expression that was far more terrifying. It was the look of someone recalling something deeply pleasurable. "They wanted to play too," he said simply. I ran. I ran into the forest, knowing it was probably exactly what he wanted, but I had no other choice. Behind me, I heard his hoarse laughter, but surprisingly, he didn't follow immediately. "Run, Roberto," he shouted. "I love it when they run." I plunged into the forest, leaping over fallen logs and pushing through thick bushes. Branches scratched my face and hands, but I didn't care. I just needed distance. After running for what felt like kilometers, I stopped to catch my breath. I was completely lost. Every tree looked the same, and I had no idea which direction the camp or the road was in. That's when I realized how silent everything was. No birds, no insects, no wind. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. "Roberto," a voice called from somewhere in the distance. "Where are you, Roberto?" The voice came from my left. I started moving stealthily to the right, trying not to make a sound. "You can't hide forever," The voice continued, now from a different direction. I know these woods better than you know your own home. I kept moving, but no matter which direction I went, his voice seemed to come from a different place. It was as if he were everywhere at once. Then I saw something that stopped me dead in my tracks. Carved into the bark of a large tree was a message. Roberto was here, day 5. He had carved my name into the tree, but I had never been in that part of the forest before. How could he know exactly where I was going to run? I looked around and noticed more trees with markings. Some had dates, others had names I didn't recognize. And then I saw one that made me feel sick. Patricia, day 12, last day of games. How many people had been here before me? How many had run through these same paths with the same terror before? What? I see you found my gallery, Eddie's voice said from very close behind me. I turned around, and there he was, less than 5 meters away. How had he gotten so close without me hearing him? Patricia was special, he continued, stepping closer. She lasted 12 days. She was very smart, very resourceful. You remind me of her. What did you do to her? I taught her how to play properly, he said, just like I taught Thomas, and Sarah and Michael. They all learned, eventually. He started closing the distance, and I backed up until my back hit a tree. But don't worry, Roberto. First, we have to play hide and seek. It's my favorite. I'll give you a 5-minute head start, and then I'll come find you. If you manage to avoid me until dawn, you win. And if I win, then you can leave, he said, but something in his eyes told me he was lying. And if I lose? His smile widened, showing all his teeth. Then we'll have plenty more time to get to know each other. He pulled an old stopwatch from his pocket. 5-minute start. Now. I ran again, but this time with a purpose. I needed to find a place to hide until dawn, or, better yet, find a way out of the forest entirely. As I ran, I tried to orient myself by the sun. If I could keep moving west, I'd eventually reach the main road. But Eddie knew these woods intimately, and I was a lost visitor. I found an especially large tree with exposed roots that created a small natural cave. I crawled under the roots and tried to control my breathing. From my hiding spot, I could see in several directions without being easily spotted. The 5 minutes passed, then the hunt began. At first, I heard nothing. Then gradually I started picking up sounds. A branch snapping here, leaves crunching there. But the sounds came from all directions, as if multiple people were searching for me. Roberto, he called from somewhere. You're getting better at this. But I can smell you from here. Was that true? Could he actually track me by scent? You smell like fear and sweat and something else. Something delicious. His voice was getting closer. I could hear his footsteps now, slow and deliberate, like those of a predator who knows its prey has nowhere to go. Come on, Roberto. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. If you come out now, I'll be gentle with you. If I have to drag you out, well, it'll be a lot less fun for you. The footsteps stopped directly above me. I could see his boots through the roots, inches from my head. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't look down. He stood there for several minutes that felt like hours. Then, to my relief, he started walking away. I waited until I couldn't hear his footsteps before daring to move. I crawled out of my hiding spot and looked around. There was no sign of him. I started moving toward what I hoped was west, staying low and trying to make as little noise as possible. The sun was setting, and soon it would be completely dark. In the darkness, he'd have all the advantages. After walking for what I estimated was an hour, I reached a small clearing. In the center was something that made me stop, a small faded tent. I approached cautiously. The tent was old and torn in several places, but there was something inside. I carefully unzipped the entrance. Inside, I found the remains of a campsite, a moldy sleeping bag, empty food cans, and something that made me feel sick. A journal. I opened it with trembling hands. The first entry was dated 3 months ago. Day 1. Arrived at Tall Pines Camp today. The place seems deserted, but it's exactly the solitude I needed after the divorce. It was almost identical to my own experience. Someone else had been here, had lived the same nightmare I was living. I kept reading. Day 3, someone's watching me. Found footprints around my cabin. Day 5, it's getting more aggressive. Slash my tires. Day 8, I'm hiding in the forest. He calls himself Eddie, says he wants to play. Day 12, I can't take it anymore. He's everywhere. He's been hunting me for days. If anyone finds this, don't come to Tall Pines Camp. Eddie is... The entry cut off there. The following pages were blank, except for one final entry in a different, rougher handwriting. Patricia lost the game, but it was so much fun playing with her. Now she's sleeping forever in the forest. I hope the next visitor is more interesting. It was signed with an E. I closed the journal with trembling hands. Patricia had been real. She had been in my exact situation, and Eddie had killed her. I see you found Patricia's journal, a voice said from the tent's entrance. I turned around, and there was Eddie, blocking the only exit. In the fading daylight, his face looked even more grotesque, with deep shadows under his sunken eyes. She was a lot like you, he continued, slowly stepping into the tent. Smart, resourceful. Lasted longer than most. Did you kill her? The hunt reached its natural conclusion, he said, shrugging. All hunts do. You're insane. Insane, he laughed. No, Roberto. I'm just doing what our ancestors did for thousands of years. Hunting. It's the purest human activity there is. He stepped closer, and I could smell his putrid breath. But you have something special. I can feel it. I think you could last even longer than Patricia. I knew I had to act. In the confined space of the tent, I couldn't run. I'd have to fight. I pretended to faint from fear, collapsing backward. When Eddie leaned in to check if I was conscious, I stabbed the kitchen knife I'd been hiding in my belt into his thigh. The blade sank into his flesh, and he screamed in pain and surprise. I used his momentary confusion to shove him aside and bolt out of the tent. You little bastard, he roared behind me. Now the game gets interesting. I ran through the forest as darkness fell, hearing his curses and cries of pain behind me. At least now he was injured. That might give me an edge, but I knew it wouldn't be enough. Eddie knew these woods like I knew my own apartment. In the dark, he'd hunt me like an animal. I needed to find the road, and fast. I spent the night moving constantly, never staying in one place for more than a few minutes. Every shadow could be Eddie. Every sound could be his footsteps closing in. At dawn, I was exhausted and dehydrated but still alive. And most importantly, I'd found something. A line of telephone poles stretching through the forest. The wires had been cut, but the poles pointed the way toward civilization. Following the line of poles, I walked for hours. The forest gradually became less dense. I could hear the distant sound of traffic. The road was just ahead. I ran the final 100 meters, emerging from the forest onto a paved 2-lane road. It was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. There was no traffic in sight, but I knew someone would pass eventually. I sat on the roadside and waited, staying alert in case Eddie appeared. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of an engine approaching. It was an old pickup truck. I stood in the middle of the road, waving my arms desperately. The truck stopped, and an older man with a gray beard rolled down the window. "You okay, son?" "You look terrible." "I need help," I managed to say. "There's a man in the forest. He's been hunting me. Please, I need to get to the police." The man looked at me with concern and opened the passenger door. "Get in. I'll take you to town." I had never been so grateful to see another human being in my life. During the 20-minute drive to the nearest town, I told the man, who introduced himself as Bill, the whole story. He listened in silence, occasionally shaking his head in disbelief. "That camp," he said finally, "has had problems before. People have gone missing there over the years. The police always assumed they got lost in the forest. At the police station, my story was met with more credibility than I expected. Apparently, there had been reports of missing persons in the area for several years, and my testimony finally gave them a concrete lead. 2 days later, A search and rescue team with tracking dogs entered the forest. They found the abandoned camp, my cabin with its broken windows, and the tent where I'd found Patricia's journal. They also found 3 bodies, buried in shallow graves in different parts of the forest. The remains were identified as Patricia Williams, Thomas Chen, and Sarah Morrison, all camp visitors who had gone missing over the past 2 years, but they never found Eddie. Investigators determined he had been living in the forest for years, likely since escaping from a mental institution in a neighboring state. He had built elaborate shelters in various parts of the forest and created a hunting territory spanning several square kilometers. Tall Pines Camp was permanently closed. The investigation revealed that the management had been negligent in reporting disappearances, trying to cover them up to protect their business. But I knew Eddie was still out there, somewhere in the vast forest. The knife wound hadn't been fatal, and he was too cunning to be caught easily. It's been 6 months since my escape from Tall Pines Camp. I've been in therapy, trying to cope with the trauma of those 6 days of terror. Most nights, I still can't sleep without pills, and the slightest noise in the dark makes me jump. I've changed my phone numbers and address twice. I don't use social media. I try to keep a low profile, but I always have the feeling I'm being watched. Because last night, I found something that reminded me my nightmare might not be over. Taped to my car's windshield was a note written in that rough handwriting I'd recognize anywhere. "Hello, Roberto. I enjoyed our game. I hope we can play again soon. E." Underneath was a new photo. It was of me leaving my new apartment that same morning. Eddie had found me, and this time, there's nowhere to run. My name is Martine, and though it's been 3 years since that night when everything changed, I still wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding as if it's about to explode in my chest. I live in a small town in the interior of Argentina, in Cordoba, where the summer heat clings to your skin like a second layer, and the nights are so silent that any noise feels like a scream in the void. I'm 35 years old, working as a mechanic in a local garage, fixing old cars brought in by neighbors with stories of failed trips and promises of adventures that never came to pass. My life was routine before this. Waking at dawn, the smell of oil and metal on my hands, a beer with friends at dusk, and the deep sleep of someone with little to lose. But that routine shattered when I accepted an invitation from an old school friend, Rodrigo, for a weekend of fishing at a remote lake in the Sierras. It wasn't something I did often. I preferred the solitude of my garage to group outings, but Rodrigo insisted so much that I gave in. "It's gonna be epic, Martine. Just us, nature, some beers, and fish that bite like crazy," he said over the phone, his enthusiastic voice contrasting with my usual apathy. I packed my rusty fishing rod, a tent inherited from my father, supplies for 2 days, cans of tuna, bread, water, and a couple of cigarette packs to calm my nerves, and set out in my beat-up Ford pickup on the dirt road winding toward the mountains. The road was treacherous, potholes that made the truck jump like it was alive, red dust sneaking through the open windows, and clouds of mosquitoes buzzing around like omens of something worse. As I drove, the midday sun beat down on the windshield, reflecting the arid landscape of thorny bushes and wind-eroded rocks. I thought about my ex-wife, Laura, who left me for lack of excitement, and wondered if this trip was my pathetic attempt to prove I could still live something intense. I arrived at the lake around 4 in the afternoon, the water still as a shattered mirror, stirred only by the occasional breeze, surrounded by tall pines casting long shadows over the shore. Rodrigo wasn't there. His message said he'd arrive later with 2 friends I didn't know. I set up my tent near the shore, the damp ground sinking under my boots, and sat to wait, smoking a cigarette while watching the sun sink behind the hills, painting the sky a bloody orange that made me uneasy for no apparent reason. Night fell like a heavy curtain, the cold seeping through the gaps in my jacket, the lake's silence broken only by the distant croaking of frogs and the occasional splash of a jumping fish. I lit a fire with dry branches I gathered nearby. The crackling wood, comforting at first but soon monotonous, amplifying my sense of isolation. Rodrigo still hadn't arrived. I checked my phone, but there was no signal, just empty bars reminding me how far I was from everything. I lay down in the tent, the sleeping bag smelling of old mildew, and tried to sleep, but the noises started. First, a crunch of dry leaves, as if someone were stepping carefully to avoid being heard. I sat up, my pulse racing, and stepped out with my flashlight, its beam slicing through the darkness like a trembling sword. Nothing, just motionless trees in the lake, black as ink. I went back inside, chalking it up to an animal, but then came the second sound, a low whisper that could have been wind or distant voices murmuring unintelligible words. My mind started playing tricks. I recalled stories of campers disappearing in these Sierras, told at the garage by customers exaggerating to pass the time, but now those tales came alive in the dark. I forced myself to close my eyes, counting breaths to calm down, but sleep was fitful, plagued by dreams of shadowy figures surrounding me, their cold hands touching my face. At dawn, with the sky gray and a thick fog cloaking the lake like a death shroud, I decided to explore to kill time until Rodrigo arrived. I walked along the shore, mud sticking to my boots, the water lapping at the rocks with a hypnotic sound. I found fresh footprints in the mud, large human prints heading toward a dense grove on the other side of the clearing. Suspense gripped my chest. Were they Rodrigo's or someone else's? I followed the tracks, my heart pounding, each step crunching in the morning silence, until I reached a small clearing hidden by thorny bushes that scratched my hands as I pushed them aside. What I saw there froze me, the air escaping my lungs in a choked gasp. 2 bodies lay on the ground, lifeless and mutilated, discarded like trash after an inhuman fury. They were 2 young guys, probably from my town or nearby, their camping clothes torn and backpacks spilled nearby, contents scattered, crushed cans, dirty clothes, a broken fishing rod. I approached with trembling legs, my stomach churning, and the horror unfolded before me in details that still haunt my nights. The first, a skinny blonde, lay face up, eyes open in an expression of eternal terror, pupils dilated like black wells. His face was a mask of violence, nose broken in multiple places, cartilage crushed against his face, dried blood forming dark crusts stretching to his ears. His lips, split from repeated blows, front teeth chipped and loose as if he'd been kicked with heavy boots over and over. Bruises covered his cheeks, deep purple mixed with yellow from older wounds, suggesting the abuse had lasted hours or days. I looked down at his torso, his unbuttoned and torn shirt revealing pale skin marked by burns. Red blistered circles, like cigarettes stubbed out on flesh, some burst with yellowish pus oozing. There were shallow incisions on his chest, straight lines made with a sharp knife, forming patterns that looked like initials or symbols, blood crusted at the edges. His arms were spread out, wrists bound with wire that had cut deep into the flesh, leaving red gashes where the skin had torn, exposing pink muscle and swollen veins. The fingernails had been ripped off, likely with pliers or teeth, the bloody tips raw, fingers twisted at impossible angles from deliberate fractures. His pants, pulled down to his ankles, revealed the most sinister, bruised and swollen genitals, with precise cuts bleeding profusely, skin lacerated as if tortured with a sharp object, perhaps a stick or a broken bottle inserted with force. His legs showed compound fractures, white bone protruding through the skin at the knee and thigh, surrounded by black bruises indicating blows with a heavy object, maybe a log or rock. His bare feet, nails also torn out, soles sliced with deep gashes, as if he'd been forced to walk on glass or thorns before the end. The smell was nauseating, metallic blood mixed with urine and excrement, suggesting he died in agony, perhaps bleeding out slowly as his torturer watched. The second guy, darker and stockier, lay on his side, curled in a fetal position as if trying to shield himself from inevitable pain in his final moments. His head was forcibly shaved, clumps of black hair scattered around like macabre confetti, the scalp covered in bleeding, irregular cuts, crusts forming chaotic patterns. His face was disfigured, one eye swollen shut from inflammation, the other nearly out of its socket, dangling by a thread of tissue, as if pulled out with cruel fingers to prolong the terror. His nose was crushed, dried blood clogging the nostrils, and his mouth was sewn shut with thick thread, clumsy stitches piercing swollen lips, blood dripping from the holes like red tears. His bare torso showed protruding broken ribs under stretched skin, bootprint-shaped bruises, and linear burns as if from a hot iron pressed against the flesh. Burst blisters, leaving suppurating craters attracting buzzing flies. His arms hung limp, shoulders dislocated with an audible pop if touched, deep incisions in the armpits suggesting controlled bleeding to keep him alive longer. His abdomen was swollen from internal blows, possibly a ruptured liver or spleen, the skin purple like an ink stain. Below, the sexual violence was evident. A lacerated and bloody anus, with wood or glass fragments protruding from clotted blood, indicating repeated brutal insertions. His legs were twisted, knees shattered as if struck with a hammer, bones pulverized under torn skin, tendons exposed. His feet were bruised, toes crushed, nails ripped out leaving raw, bloody tips. The entire clearing was a slaughterhouse scene. Blood splattered on nearby rocks, large boot prints around the bodies, and abandoned tools. A rusty, serrated knife, pliers with flesh residue, blood-soaked ropes. A crumpled note in the darker guy's hand read, "For meddling where they shouldn't," written in shaky handwriting, as if the killer had savored the moment. Panic hit me like a cold wave, my ragged breathing breaking the silence as my mind raced to process the scene. Who had done this? A crazed hunter, a fugitive, or someone from a nearby town with dark secrets. I recalled rumors at the garage about missing people in the Sierras, attributed to accidents but now taking on a sinister meaning. I looked around, the forest seeming to close in on me. I packed everything in minutes, the pickup's engine roaring like a wounded animal as I sped down the dirt road, dust billowing behind like a smoke cloud. On the way, I stopped at an abandoned gas station, vomiting beside the truck, acid burning my throat as images of the bodies flashed in my mind. Torn flesh, empty eyes, pain etched in every wound. I called the police from there, my broken voice describing the horror, but the connection was bad, and they said a patrol would come, though the remote area meant it'd take hours. I got back to Cordoba that night, my apartment feeling like a fragile refuge with locks I now doubted were enough. Nightmares started that same night. I relived the scene, but now I was the one tortured, feeling the crack of bones in my own fingers, the burn of cigarettes on my chest, the violent invasion tearing my insides. I woke screaming, soaked in sweat, and for days I didn't go out, eating what was in the fridge, the phone ringing with Rodrigo's calls asking what happened. He never showed. Some last-minute issue, he said. The police confirmed the find. The guys were students from Buenos Aires, missing for a week, tortured by someone who knew the area. But there were no leads, just speculation about a serial killer stalking lone campers. The days that followed were a whirlwind of constant tension. I received an anonymous package at the garage, wrapped in plain brown paper, containing Polaroid photos of the bodies, taken from angles I hadn't seen, with more graphic details, zooms on genital lacerations, torn out nails, and a note. "You saw them. Now I see you." Terror settled in like a permanent tenant, checking shadows in every corner of the garage, engine noises sounding like stealthy footsteps. I tried investigating on my own. I spoke to old-timers at the local bar, who mentioned an ex-convict living in the Sierras, marked by prison, with a grudge against young trespassers, but the police dismissed him as harmless. One night at my apartment, I heard knocks on the door. I opened it with a hammer in hand, but no one was there, just a note on the floor. remembered their screams. Suspense consumed me. I slept with lights on, my sleep fragmented by visions of the abuses. The knife slicing skin, wire cutting until it bled, brutal insertions leaving broken bodies. I moved to a new apartment, but the package followed. More photos, this time of me at the garage taken from afar with red crosses over my face. The severe violence I imagined in those guys became personal. I felt the ghost of pain in my own flesh, imagining fractures in my legs, burns on my torso. Therapy helped little. The psychologist said PTSD, but how do you explain real stalking? A month later, an anonymous call. Come back to the lake, or I'll come for you. The terror peaked when I found my pickup vandalized, tires slashed with precise cuts, like those on the bodies, and a note inside, "Soon you'll be like them." I live in constant alert, the world a sinister place where humanity hides behind masks, and the memory of those abuses, details etched in my soul, reminds me that evil is real, lurking in the shadows of daily routine. In my childhood, I grew up in a nearby town where the Sierras were our playground, climbing rocks and fishing in streams with my father, who taught me to respect nature but warned of bad people hiding in the forests. Those innocent memories are now tainted with darkness. Compared to the brutality I saw, those guys had no chance, likely captured while sleeping, bound and subjected to systematic torture. First blows to subdue, then burns for slow pain, fractures to immobilize, and sexual abuse to humiliate before the end. At the garage, while fixing a car, I'd imagined the crack of a bone like a broken axle, the burn of a cigarette like an overheated engine. One night, I got an anonymous video by email, grainy footage of someone in the Sierras, beating a mannequin with a stick, screaming, "This is for nosy people." The sound echoing in my room like the imagined screams of those guys. Suspense devoured me. I went out little, ate poorly, my weight dropping as fear grew. I finally spoke to Rodrigo, who admitted he canceled due to a bad feeling but now doubted everything. The police closed the case as isolated, but I knew better. The killer was free, and my life a constant wait for his next move. My name is Juana, and this is the story of the 7 most terrifying days of my life. 7 days that changed me forever, that taught me what I'm capable of when survival is all that matters. It all started so normally that it now feels surreal. It was July, I had just turned 22, and I decided to take a solo vacation after finishing my university degree. Green Valley Camp seemed perfect. Rustic cabins, hiking trails, and the promise of peace and quiet in the mountains. I arrived in my small blue Honda Civic in the mid-afternoon, my backpack filled with books, and the naive expectation of spending 2 weeks reading by the lake. The camp was emptier than I expected. The peak season hadn't officially started yet. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with a forced smile, assigned me cabin number 12. "It's a bit far from the others," she warned, "but it's very quiet." Perfect for someone seeking solitude, the cabin was at the end of a winding trail, surrounded by tall pines that made it almost invisible from the main camp area. It was small but cozy, with a single bed, a table, and a tiny kitchen. What I loved most was the window overlooking the forest. I thought it would be perfect for reading while enjoying nature. That first night, after unpacking and making a simple dinner, I sat on the small porch with a cup of tea and my favorite book. The silence of the forest was so deep I could hear my own breathing. Every now and then, an owl would hoot in the distance, or I'd hear the whisper of wind through the leaves. It was around 10 at night when I first noticed something was wrong. I was reading when I heard footsteps on the trail. At first, I thought it was another guest returning late to their cabin, but the steps stopped in front of mine. I froze, waiting for them to move on, but they didn't. I cautiously approached the window and looked out. On the trail, faintly lit by moonlight, I could make out a man's silhouette. He stood completely still, staring directly at my cabin. My heart started racing. Maybe it was a camp employee checking things were okay. I opened the door a few inches and called out, "Hello?" Can I help you with something?" The man didn't respond. He didn't even move. He was like a statue. I quickly shut the door and locked it. Through the window, I kept watching. The man stayed there for at least 20 minutes before finally walking away, disappearing into the trees. That night, I slept poorly, startling at every forest sound. I told myself it was probably my imagination, or maybe a confused guest who'd had too much to drink. But part of me knew something was deeply wrong with that motionless figure in the dark. I woke early, hoping daylight would dispel my nighttime fears. I made coffee and went out to the porch to enjoy the fresh morning air. That's when I saw it. In the mud in front of my cabin were boot prints, many prints, as if someone had been circling the structure for hours. But the most disturbing part was that some prints were directly under my windows, as if someone had stood there, looking inside. I dressed quickly and went to the reception to report it. The camp seemed even more deserted during the day. I didn't see any other guests on the way. The receptionist, who introduced herself as Margaret, listened to my story with an expression I couldn't quite read. Was it concern or something else? "Oh dear," she said finally. "It was probably just our security guard doing his nightly rounds. Sometimes they linger a bit longer than necessary to ensure everything's okay, especially with guests who are alone." "A security guard? You didn't mention that when I booked." "It's a new thing," she replied quickly. "We've had some minor incidents. Nothing serious, but we want to make sure our guests feel safe." Something about her tone made me uneasy, but I couldn't pinpoint why. I decided to take a walk around the camp to get more familiar with the area. Green Valley Camp was larger than I'd initially thought. There were about 20 cabins spread across several square kilometers, connected by winding trails. There was a small lake in the center, surrounded by picnic areas and a wooden dock. What struck me was how empty everything was. In the middle of summer, I expected to see at least a few families or couples, but it seemed I was the only guest. During my walk, I came across a part of the camp that appeared to be under construction or renovation. Several cabins had boarded up windows and scattered construction tools. A wire fence surrounded the area, with signs reading, "No entry, construction zone." But oddly, there were no workers anywhere, nor any sounds of construction. The tools looked rusty and old, as if they'd been there for a long time. That afternoon, I decided to stay near the main camp area. I sat by the lake with my book, but found it hard to focus. Every time I looked up, I felt like someone was watching me from the surrounding forest. At dusk, I returned to my cabin with some apprehension. I'd bought supplies at the camp's small store, including an extra flashlight and some canned goods. Something told me it was better to be prepared. That night, I closed all the curtains before dark and propped a chair against the door. It was probably an unnecessary precaution, but it made me feel better. Around midnight, I heard it again. This time, it wasn't just footsteps. It was the sound of someone trying the door, gently turning the knob. My heart stopped. The sound stopped. But then I heard something much worse. The slow creak of the porch floorboards, as if someone was walking very slowly around the cabin. I grabbed my phone to call reception, but there was no signal. I remembered Margaret mentioning that coverage was spotty in the more remote cabins. The sound of footsteps continued for what felt like hours. Sometimes they stopped right under a window, and I could swear I heard heavy breathing on the other side of the wall. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I was determined to leave. This had stopped being a relaxing vacation and turned into a nightmare. But when I went to my car, I found all 4 tires completely deflated. Not punctured, but deliberately deflated, as if someone had let the air out. And there was something else. My keys weren't in my bag where I'd left them. I ran back to reception but found a note taped to the door. "Family emergency. Back tomorrow." Margaret and I was alone in the camp. I returned to my car and searched desperately for my keys. I finally found them, hanging from a tree branch 3 meters high, completely out of my reach. Someone was playing a cruel prank, or something much worse. I decided to walk to the main road to get help, but when I reached the camp's entrance, I found the gate chained shut with a new padlock. A sign read, "Camp closed for maintenance. Sorry for the inconvenience." But I was inside. How could they close the camp with me still here? I tried climbing the fence, but it was too high and topped with barbed wire. I was effectively trapped. Panic started to take hold. This wasn't random. Someone had deliberately isolated me. I ran back to my cabin to grab my essentials and find another place to hide. But when I got there, the door was wide open. Inside, everything had been ransacked. My clothes were strewn across the floor, my books tossed everywhere, and my toiletries emptied into the sink. But the most disturbing thing was what I found on my bed. There was a photograph. It was of me, taken the previous night while reading on the porch. It was shot from the forest with a zoom that clearly captured my face. On the back, someone had written, "We'll get to know each other better soon." My hands shook as I held the photo. Someone had been watching me, photographing me, planning something. And now I was trapped with them. I took only the essentials, my flashlight, some food, water, and the kitchen knife, and left the cabin. I couldn't stay there. I needed to find a place to hide until I could figure out an escape plan. I remembered the construction zone I'd seen the day before. Maybe I could hide in one of the abandoned cabins until help arrived. But as I headed that way, I heard something that chilled my blood. The sound of an engine. A vehicle was approaching on the main trail. I hid behind a large tree and watched. It was a black pickup truck I hadn't seen before. It stopped in front of my cabin. Two men got out. One was tall and thin, with long, dirty hair. The other was shorter, but stockier, with a beard and a baseball cap. I didn't recognize them. They definitely weren't camp staff. "She's not here," the tall one said, looking toward the open cabin. "Probably ran into the woods," the other replied. "Like the others." The others. How many people had been in my situation before? "This is getting tedious," the man in the cap continued. "Maybe we should switch locations." "No," the tall one said firmly. "This place is perfect. Too isolated for anyone to hear screams, and the police never patrol here. We just need to be more careful with selection." My blood turned to ice. I was listening to two kidnappers, or worse, discussing me like I was merchandise. "Let's search the perimeter," the man in the cap said. "She can't have gone far. And when we find her..." I didn't wait to hear the rest. I ran as quietly as I could toward the construction zone, staying low and using the trees for cover. I reached the fence surrounding the abandoned cabins and found a spot where the wire was loose. I slipped underneath and ran to the farthest cabin. The door was ajar. Inside, the cabin was in ruins, broken windows, overturned furniture, and a smell of damp and rot that made me gag. But in the farthest corner, behind a fallen cabinet, there was a small space where I could hide. I curled up there with my supplies and tried to control my breathing. From my hiding spot, I could hear distant voices. They were searching for me. I spent the entire night in the abandoned cabin, not daring to move. The voices continued until late, getting closer and then farther away, but they never reached the construction zone. At dawn, I risked leaving my hiding spot to better explore my temporary refuge. The cabin had 2 rooms and a small bathroom. The roof had several holes letting in light, but also rain. In the back room, I found something that gave me hope. A broken window leading directly into the dense forest. If I had to flee quickly, that would be my escape route. While exploring, I found evidence that I wasn't the first to use this cabin as a refuge. In one corner were empty food cans, some relatively recent. And carved into the wooden wall with something sharp were several messages. Help. Day 6. EMS. Don't trust Margaret. She helps them. There are more cabins underground. The last message made me feel sick. Underground cabins? What kind of operation were they running here? During the day, I stayed hidden, only venturing out briefly to get water from a rusty faucet that still worked at the back of the cabin. From the windows, I could occasionally see the black pickup patrolling the camp's trails. That afternoon, While watching from my hiding spot, I saw something that confirmed my worst fears. The two men had returned, but this time they weren't alone. They had a young woman, maybe my age, with her hands tied in a bag over her head. They put her in the back of the pickup and drove toward the farthest part of the camp, an area I hadn't explored before. It was clear I wasn't their first victim, and now they'd brought someone else. I knew I had to do something, but what? I was alone, with no way to contact the outside world, facing at least 2 armed men. That night, I decided to risk exploring more of the camp. I needed to understand what I was up against and maybe find a way to help the other woman. I waited until very late before leaving my hiding spot. The moon was hidden by clouds, providing perfect cover to move unseen. I headed toward the area where I'd seen the pickup disappear. It was a part of the camp not shown on the map they'd given me at reception, beyond the lake and deeper into the dense forest. After walking for what felt like kilometers, following a barely visible trail, I reached a clearing where my blood froze. There was a cabin, but not like the others. This one was larger, sturdier, with bars on the windows. It looked more like a prison than a camp lodging. The black pickup was parked outside. I crept closer, staying in the forest shadows. From my position, I could see light inside and occasionally heard male voices. But I also heard something else, sobbing. I circled the cabin until I found a back window where I could look inside without being spotted. What I saw made me stifle a scream. There were 3 women inside, all young, all clearly terrified. They sat on the floor with their hands tied, in what looked like a bare room except for some dirty mattresses on the floor. One was the woman I'd seen brought in that afternoon. The other 2 looked like they'd been there longer. Their faces were gaunt, their clothes dirty. And then I saw something that made me understand the true nature of what was happening. On the wall were dozens of photographs taped up. Pictures of young women, all clearly taken without their knowledge. And I recognized some of the faces. They'd been on the news. Young women reported missing over the past few years. This wasn't just a kidnapping. It was a human trafficking operation. I knew I had to act, but I also knew if I got caught, I'd become another victim. I needed a plan. I returned to my hiding spot before dawn, my mind racing to come up with a strategy. I had to find a way to free those women and escape, but I was at a disadvantage in every way. During the day, from my hiding spot, I observed my captor's movement patterns. The tall man seemed to be the leader. He stayed at the prison cabin most of the time. The man in the cap patrolled the camp in the pickup, probably looking for me. "Let's search the perimeter," the man in the cap said. "She can't have gone far. And when we find her..." I didn't wait to hear the rest. I ran as quietly as I could toward the construction zone, staying low and using the trees for cover. I reached the fence surrounding the abandoned cabins and found a spot where the wire was loose. I slipped underneath and ran to the farthest cabin. The door was ajar. Inside, the cabin was in ruins, broken windows, overturned furniture, and a smell of damp and rot that made me gag. But in the farthest corner, behind a fallen cabinet, there was a small space where I could hide. I curled up there with my supplies and tried to control my breathing. From my hiding spot, I could hear distant voices. They were searching for me. I spent the entire night in the abandoned cabin, not daring to move. The voices continued until late, getting closer and then farther away, but they never reached the construction zone. At dawn, I risked leaving my hiding spot to better explore my temporary refuge. The cabin had 2 rooms and a small bathroom. The roof had several holes letting in light, but also rain. In the back room, I found something that gave me hope. A broken window leading directly into the dense forest. If I had to flee quickly, that would be my escape route. While exploring, I found evidence that I wasn't the first to use this cabin as a refuge. In one corner were empty food cans, some relatively recent, and carved into the wooden wall with something sharp were several messages. "Help. Day 6. EMS. Don't trust Margaret. She helps them. There are more cabins underground." The last message made me feel sick. Underground cabins? What kind of operation were they running here? During the day, I stayed hidden, only venturing out briefly to get water from a rusty faucet that still worked at the back of the cabin. From the windows, I could occasionally see the black pickup patrolling the camp's trails. That afternoon, while watching from my hiding spot, I saw something that confirmed my worst fears. The two men had returned, but this time they weren't alone. They had a young woman, maybe my age, with her hands tied and a bag over her head. They put her in the back of the pickup and drove toward the farthest part of the camp, an area I hadn't explored before. It was clear I wasn't their first victim, and now they'd brought someone else. I knew I had to do something, but what? I was alone, with no way to contact the outside world, facing at least 2 armed men. That night, I decided to risk exploring more of the camp. I needed to understand what I was up against and maybe find a way to help the other woman. I waited until very late before leaving my hiding spot. The moon was hidden by clouds, providing perfect cover to move unseen. I headed toward the area where I'd seen the pickup disappear. It was a part of the camp not shown on the map they'd given me at reception, beyond the lake and deeper into the dense forest. After walking for what felt like kilometers, following a barely visible trail, I reached a clearing where my blood froze. There was a cabin, but not like the others. This one was larger, sturdier, with bars on the windows. It looked more like a prison than a camp lodging. The black pickup was parked outside. I crept closer, staying in the forest shadows. From my position, I could see light inside and occasionally heard male voices. But I also heard something else, sobbing. I circled the cabin until I found a back window, where I could look inside without being spotted. What I saw made me stifle a scream. There were 3 women inside, all young, all clearly terrified. They sat on the floor with their hands tied in what looked like a bare room except for some dirty mattresses on the floor. One was the woman I'd seen brought in that afternoon. The other 2 looked like they'd been there longer. Their faces were gaunt, their clothes dirty. And then I saw something that made me understand the true nature of what was happening. On the wall were dozens of photographs taped up, pictures of young women, all clearly taken without their knowledge. And I recognized some of the faces. They'd been on the news. Young women reported missing over the past few years. This wasn't just a kidnapping. It was a human trafficking operation. I knew I had to act, but I also knew if I got caught, I'd become another victim. I needed a plan. I returned to my hiding spot before dawn, my mind racing to come up with a strategy. I had to find a way to free those women and escape, but I was at a disadvantage in every way. During the day, from my hiding spot, I observed my captor's movement patterns. The tall man seemed to be the leader. He stayed at the prison cabin most of the time. The man in the cap patrolled the camp in the pickup, probably looking for me. We can't stick to the main trail, Jessica decided. They know these paths better than we do. We have to go through the forest. It was harder and would take longer, but it was safer. For the next 2 hours, we pushed through the dense forest, helping each other over fallen logs and through small streams. Amy was getting worse. She'd lost a lot of weight during her captivity, and her strength was fading fast. "Leave me here," she said finally, collapsing against a tree. "I'm just slowing you down." "Absolutely not," I replied. "We get out together or no one gets out." It was Lisa who had the idea that saved us. "There's a small cave about 100 meters north," she said. "Jessica and I can keep going to the ranger cabin for help while Juana stays with Amy." I didn't like splitting up, but Amy needed rest, and sending 2 people for help doubled our chances of success. We found the cave Lisa mentioned. It was small but dry, hidden behind a curtain of ferns. Amy and I hid there while Jessica and Lisa continued to the ranger cabin. "Thank you," Amy murmured as she curled up on the cave floor, "for not leaving me behind." "No one gets left behind," I replied, though I wasn't sure we could keep that promise. We spent the next hours in tense silence, jumping at every forest sound. Occasionally, we heard the pickup in the distance, but it seemed the men were focusing their search on the main trail area. At dawn, I started to worry. Jessica and Lisa had been gone for over 6 hours. Something had gone wrong. "I'm going to look for them," I told Amy. "No," she replied weakly. "If you get caught, no one will know where I am. Wait a little longer." She was right, but the waiting was agonizing. It was around noon when we finally heard something, sirens in the distance. "Is that the police?" Amy asked. Her eyes filled with hope for the first time in days. The sirens grew closer, and then we heard something else. A helicopter overhead. Jessica and Lisa had made it. They'd reached the ranger cabin and called for help. We cautiously left the cave and headed toward the sirens. Amy was stronger now, fueled by the hope of rescue. After walking for 20 minutes, we saw flashing lights through the trees. A group of police officers and paramedics had set up a command post in a clearing. "Here!" I shouted, waving my arms. "We're here!" Paramedics rushed to us immediately. Amy was carried on a stretcher to an ambulance while I was checked for serious injuries. A detective approached as the paramedics finished examining me. "I'm Detective Morrison," he introduced himself. "Your friends told us what happened. Can you tell us how many other women might still be held?" "I don't know for sure," I replied. "But there were photos on the wall. Dozens of them. They've been doing this for years." The detective nodded grimly. "We've arrested 3 people, 2 men and a woman who identified herself as the camp manager. But we need your statement to fully understand what was happening here." Over the next hours, I told them everything I'd seen and experienced. The police searched the entire camp, finding evidence of a human trafficking operation that had been running for at least 5 years. The construction zone I'd seen was a front. Beneath one of the abandoned cabins, they found an underground bunker where victims were held before being moved elsewhere. Margaret, the receptionist, had been identifying potential victims for years. Young women traveling alone, paying in cash, with no strong ties to the area. She'd pass the information to her accomplices, who would kidnap and hold them until they could be sold to higher-level traffickers. A week after arriving at Green Valley Camp, I was finally free. But freedom came with an emotional cost I hadn't anticipated. At the hospital, while waiting for my parents, I learned more about the operation we'd exposed. Investigations revealed that at least 12 women had disappeared from the camp over the past 5 years. Some had been recovered from other locations, but others were still missing. Amy, Jessica, Lisa, and I were the lucky ones. We had escaped, but nightmares started almost immediately. Every night, I relived those 7 days. The terror of being hunted, the desperation of being trapped, the responsibility of protecting the other women. Therapists told me it was normal, that the trauma would take time to heal, but something else gnawed at me. Survivor's guilt. Why had I escaped when others didn't? Why was I lucky enough to be in the farthest cabin, giving me time to hide? Why had I found that refuge in the construction zone? I spent months in therapy, working through these feelings. Slowly, I began to understand that my survival wasn't just luck. I'd made smart decisions under extreme pressure. I'd stayed calm when I could have panicked. I'd risked my own safety to save other women. Amy fully recovered after several months of rehabilitation. Jessica and Lisa also got the help they needed. We stay in touch, bonded by an experience none of us will ever forget. The trial lasted nearly a year. Margaret, whose real name was Margaret Hendricks, was sentenced to life without parole. The 2 men, Robert Crane and David Mueller, received similar sentences. During the trial, it was revealed they'd been operating not just at Green Valley Camp, but at several similar sites across the state. The trafficking network was much larger than we'd initially imagined. My testimony, along with that of the other survivors, was crucial in shutting down the entire operation and bringing those responsible to justice. It's been 2 years since my escape from Green Valley Camp. I've returned to normal in many ways. I finished my graduate studies, got a job I love, even started dating someone. But some things have changed forever. I no longer travel alone. I thoroughly research any place I stay. I keep an emergency plan and always ensure someone knows exactly where I am, and I volunteer with organizations that help human trafficking survivors. I've learned that my experience, as horrific as it was, has given me a unique perspective and the ability to help others who've gone through similar traumas. Sometimes, when I'm helping another survivor process their trauma, I think about those 7 days in the darkness. I think about the person I was before that experience, naive, trusting, perhaps too willing to see the best in people. That person is gone. She was replaced by someone stronger, more cautious, more aware of the dangers in the world, but also someone more compassionate, more determined to help others, more grateful for every day of freedom. Green Valley Camp was permanently closed. The property was sold to the state and turned into a nature park. There's a small plaque near the entrance honoring the victims who didn't survive. I visited the site once, a year after the trial. I needed to see it again, to prove to myself it no longer had power over me. The buildings had been demolished, and nature was already reclaiming the area. Where the prison cabin once stood, there was now just a field of wildflowers. As I stood there, in the place where I'd faced my worst fears, I realized something important. I had survived not just physically, but emotionally. I had taken that terrible experience and turned it into something I could use to help others. The 7 days in the darkness were over, but the light that followed, the light of healing, purpose, and hope, that light would shine forever. As I walked away from what was once Green Valley Camp, I didn't look back. The past was behind me. My future, and the future of all the women I could help, was ahead. And for the first time in 2 years, I felt truly free. My name is Lucia, and though it's been 2 years since that weekend that shattered us all, I still can't sleep without the lights on, and every creak in the night makes me relive the terror that engulfed us at that remote camp in the Mendoza Sierras, Argentina. There were 4 of us, me, just turned 24, working as a waitress in a Buenos Aires cafe to pay for university. My best friend Camila, the outgoing one, always with her contagious laugh and sunlit blonde hair. Sophia, the quiet one, a psychology student who analyzed everything with her deep, thoughtful gaze. And Valeria, the adventurer, who organized this trip because we needed to disconnect from the city and reconnect with nature. Valeria was always dragging us into these wild plans, impromptu trips, parties until dawn, and now this camping trip at a place called Mirror Lake, an isolated spot she'd found on an online trekking forum. It's perfect, girls. Crystal clear water, dense forests, and 0 cell signal so no one bothers us, she said excitedly as we packed the car, an old Volkswagen Gol belonging to her father that groaned with every bump on the road. We set out on a Friday morning, the sun warming the asphalt as we sang pop songs at full volume, the wind rushing through the open windows and tousling our hair. The drive took about 6 hours. First the endless flat pampas, green fields dotted with grazing cows and horses, then the winding ascent into the Sierras, the air turning cooler and scented with pine and damp earth. We stopped at a roadside diner for Milanesa sandwiches and to stretch our legs, laughing at silly things like the boys eyeing us from the next table, unaware that soon our laughter would turn to stifled screams. We arrived at the camp around 4 in the afternoon, the lake reflecting the mountains like a perfect mirror, the setting sun casting everything in a warm golden glow that made us feel invincible. We unloaded our backpacks, set up 2 tents, one for Camilla and me, another for Sophia and Valeria, near the shore, the soft ground smelling of moss and fallen leaves. We lit a campfire with dry branches we gathered, the crackling wood comforting, and sat on makeshift log seats to roast marshmallows and share childhood stories, the smoke spiraling into the starry sky that stretched above us like an infinite blanket. That first night felt magical, or so it seemed. We laughed until our stomachs hurt, shared secrets about failed loves and future dreams, and went to bed exhausted but happy. the sound of water lapping the shore, lulling us like a lullaby. We didn't know he was already watching us from the forest shadows, his presence invisible but palpable. Like a cold breath on our necks, we mistook for the night breeze. I woke around 3 in the morning to a strange noise, a crunch of dry branches, as if someone were stepping deliberately to avoid being heard, followed by a low whisper that could have been the wind filtering through the trees, or something more sinister, like a held breath. I sat up in the tent, the sleeping bag clinging to my sweaty skin despite the cold, and shook Camilla, who mumbled something incoherent and rolled over. "Shh, listen," I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears like a distant drum. We waited in silence, the tent faintly lit by moonlight filtering through the thin fabric. And there it was again, soft footsteps, approaching and then stopping just outside the entrance. Suspense gripped my stomach like an invisible hand. I imagined animals, a fox, maybe a puma, but instinct told me it was human. Someone lurking in the dark with intentions I didn't want to imagine. Camilla sat up, her eyes wide and frightened in the dim light, whispering, "What's that?" I grabbed the flashlight beside me, its metal cold in my trembling hand, and turned it on, aiming at the tent's entrance. The beam cut through the night, revealing only leaf-covered ground and the extinguished campfire, residual smoke rising like ghosts. I stepped out cautiously, the night air biting my exposed skin, and swept the light around. Motionless trees, the black still lake, the other girl's tent intact. Nothing. I went back inside, laughing nervously to mask the fear that had settled in my chest like a heavy weight, telling Camilla it was just my imagination. But neither of us slept well the rest of the night, huddled together, every sound amplified by the forest's oppressive silence. At dawn, with the sun filtering through the branches and tinting the lake pink, we got up exhausted but determined to enjoy the day. Sophia and Valeria were already outside, brewing coffee in an improvised pot over rekindled embers, and I told them about the noises, but they brushed it off. Probably an animal, Lou. Don't be paranoid, we laughed, but suspense had taken root, a seed of doubt growing with each hour. We ate breakfast, bread with dulce de leche, the sweet taste contrasting with the bitterness in my mouth from broken sleep, and decided to explore. We walked a trail along the lake, the ground crunching under our hiking boots, the fresh air filling our lungs with pine resin and damp earth. We found a perfect clearing for swimming, the water cold but inviting, and stripped to our bikinis, laughing as we splashed each other, the sun warming our wet skin. That's when I saw him for the first time, a distant figure among the trees across the lake, motionless watching us. I blinked, thinking it was a mirage or a twisted log, but when I looked again, he was gone. I didn't say anything, not wanting to ruin the moment, but terror seeped in like slow poison, making my laughter sound forced as we returned to camp, the sun now less warm, the tree shadows longer and more menacing. The afternoon passed with games and chatter, but suspense wouldn't leave me. I noticed small details, like broken branches near the tents I didn't recall seeing before, or a large boot print in the mud by the fire, bigger than ours. Valeria attributed it to other campers. "This place isn't as remote as it seems," she said, but I felt eyes on us, an invisible presence watching from the forest depths. At dusk, as we grilled chorizos over the campfire, the smoke stinging my eyes, we heard a noise again. A low whistle, like a distorted melody, coming from the trees. Sophia went pale, her voice trembling, as she asked, "Did you hear that?" We fell silent, the fire crackling like mocking laughter, and there it was. The whistle repeated closer, a simple but sinister tune like a perverted children's song. Camilla grabbed my hand, her nails digging into my palm, and Valeria shouted into the darkness, "Whoever's there, come out." This isn't funny. The whistling stopped abruptly, leaving a heavy silence that enveloped us like a suffocating blanket. We retreated to the tents early that night, zipping the entrances with trembling hands huddling together, whispering plans to leave at dawn if things got worse. But the harassment was just beginning. Around midnight, something brushed the tent's fabric, a finger or branch dragging slowly across the outside, the sound scraping like nails on a chalkboard. Camilla stifled a scream, and I turned on the flashlight, illuminating a hand silhouette pressed against the fabric from outside, fingers spread like claws. I screamed, and the hand withdrew, followed by hurried footsteps fading into the dark. We all rushed out, flashlights in hand, beams dancing erratically over the trees, but nothing. Only a note pinned to a nearby tree. "Pretty girls. I see you." The crumpled paper, scrawled in black marker with jagged handwriting, froze our blood. Sophia started crying, her body shaking in the cold night, and Valeria suggested leaving immediately, but the car was an hour's walk down the dark trail, and fear paralyzed us. We returned to one tent, huddled together, as if that could protect us, suspense building like an impending storm, each minute stretching into an eternity of terror. The next day, the sun rose as if nothing had happened, but the camp was no longer a paradise. Shadows seemed denser, the lake less inviting, and we moved cautiously, eyes always on the trees. We found more notes that morning, one in the coffee pot. "I like how you smell," with a lock of blonde hair taped to it, Camilla's, that made her vomit beside the tent, acid burning her throat as she sobbed. Another in my backpack. "Lucia, you're my favorite. I want to touch you." The sinister detail churned my stomach. How did he know my name? Had he heard us talking? The harassment was becoming personal, invasive, as if he'd been listening to every word, every laugh, from the shadows. We decided to pack and leave, panic speeding our movements, trembling hands folding the tent fabric, the damp ground sticking to our knees. But as we loaded the car, we heard the whistle again, closer from the forest. Sophia stayed behind to put out the campfire, and that was her mistake. She screamed, a piercing sound that sliced the air like a knife, and we ran to her. We found her on the ground, face pale, hand covering her mouth where he'd forcibly kissed her, his rancid breath still on her skin. He grabbed me. He touched me, she sobbed, her blouse torn, exposing fresh bruises on her arm where he'd gripped her tightly, finger marks like burns on her flesh. Terror overwhelmed us. We saw him then, a tall, hooded figure fleeing through the trees, his low laugh echoing like a malevolent echo. We loaded Sophia into the car, the engine roaring as we sped down the trail, branches whipping the windows like hands trying to stop us. But the path was blocked, a log deliberately placed across, and he emerged from nowhere, a mask covering his face, knife in hand. He forced us out, his voice deep and distorted through the fabric. "You're not leaving so soon, bitches." The fun's just starting. What followed was a nightmare of abuse and violence that marked us forever. He dragged us back to the camp, binding us with rough ropes that cut our wrists, the friction burning our skin until it bled, red drops dripping onto the ground. He attacked Valeria first, a punch to the stomach that doubled her over, vomit rising in her throat as she gasped for air, bruises forming instantly like dark stains on her abdomen. "Scream, bitch," he growled, kicking her ribs, the crack of bone echoing in the clearing like dry thunder. He forced her to her knees, yanking her hair until tears streamed down her cheeks and touched her, rough hands sliding up her skirt, scratching her thighs until they bled, digging into her intimacy with brutal force, his fingers like blades tearing sensitive tissue. Valeria sobbed, her body trembling in agony, but he laughed, prolonging the abuse with bites on her neck that bled, teeth sinking into her skin until it broke. Camilla was next. He tied her to a tree, the bark scraping her back as he stripped her, tearing her shirt with the knife, the cold blade grazing her skin and leaving shallow cuts that burned like fire. He struck her face, swelling her eyes shut, blood dripping from her broken nose, and raped her there, his heavy body pressing against hers, violent thrusts making her scream, pain radiating from her core like waves of fire. "You like it, slut," he whispered, burning her chest with a cigarette, her skin bubbling and blisters forming as she writhed in vain. Sophia and I watched in horror, bound together, terror paralyzing us as he turned to us, his hot breath on our faces, reeking of sweat and malice. The abuse of Sophia was the most sinister, prolonged over hours that felt eternal, the sun setting and staining the sky red like blood. He separated her from us, dragging her into the forest, her scream echoing through the trees like a lament. We found her later, broken, clothes torn, body covered in purple bruises spreading like maps of torture across her torso and legs, precise cuts on her arms where he'd marked her with the knife, initials carved into her bleeding skin. He'd raped her repeatedly with forest objects, rough sticks that lacerated her insides, leaving blood and splinters, her agony visible in tear tracks on her dirt-streaked face. He beat her until her ribs cracked, the pain making her urinate. In humiliation, he celebrated with guttural laughter. "You're mine now," he growled, burning her with a knife heated in the fire, the blade hissing against her thigh, scorched flesh smelling like burnt barbecue. Sophia sobbed silently by the end, her spirit shattered, eyes empty as she stared into nothingness, left bleeding and trembling in the cold. We escaped when he got distracted with Valeria again. Camilla bit his hand. I kicked his knee and we ran to the car, shoving the log aside with adrenaline-fueled strength, the engine roaring as we fled, Sophia moaning in the back seat. We reached a hospital. The police got involved, but he was never caught, his shadow haunting us in nightmares. Sophia never fully recovered, her body scarred forever, and we live with constant terror, checking shadows, knowing human evil lurks in unexpected places. I remember every detail of Sophia's abuse as if I lived it. The crack of her ribs under his fists, bruises blooming like toxic flowers, the hiss of the hot blade on her skin, blisters bursting with pus, the brutal insertions, blood mixed with dirt, her stifled screams turning to broken moans. In the hospital, stitches for her wounds, therapy for the trauma. But the fear remains, a sinister companion whispering he could return. The camp was our hell, a reminder that human darkness is real and lurks in the nature we thought innocent.